The rupture occurred without warning or ceremony. In the aftermath of Shibuya, when Gojo Satoru unleashed Hollow Purple at maximum output against the tide of transfigured humans, the technique's imaginary mass carved through more than physical matter. It struck a weakness in dimensional fabric that had existed unnoticed since before recorded history, a natural fault line between realities where the laws governing different universes pressed against each other in unstable equilibrium. The collision didn't produce an explosion or visible distortion. It simply created absence, a void, where space itself forgot how to exist properly. Gojō felt the wrongness before his conscious mind registered the danger. His six eyes perceived cascading failures in the cursed energy patterns around him, readings that violated fundamental principles he'd relied on since childhood. The mathematics underlying Limitless became nonsensical as the constants defining space and distance shifted without permission. He tried activating Infinity's automatic defense, tried subdividing the approach of whatever was pulling at him, but his cursed energy dispersed into geometries his inherited sight couldn't parse. The dimensional membrane tore. He fell through layers of reality like a body sinking through deep water, each successive barrier offering less resistance than the last. There was no pain, no sensation of acceleration, only profound displacement as he passed through spaces where cursed energy had never existed and conceptually could not exist. His body remained intact through mechanisms he didn't understand, preserved by some mercy of physics that operated beyond jujutsu theory. Then gravity seized him. Actual gravity, consistent and relentless, pulling him toward an unfamiliar planet. Gojo's first coherent thought in Earth 616 was that the sky appeared fundamentally incorrect. The atmospheric composition scattered light at wavelengths his enhanced vision found jarring, and the background radiation permeating everything carried signatures utterly unlike the cursed energy that colored his homeworld. Below him spread a massive city in grid formation, its architecture both recognizable and alien. At 300 feet above ground, Infinity finally caught hold of this new reality's physics. Deceleration from terminal velocity to motionless hovering occurred between heartbeats. Gojō floated above canyons of steel and glass, his cursed energy creating ripples in local space-time that his six eyes struggled to interpret. The air surrounding him shimmered with visible distortion, heat haze patterns spiraling outward in mathematical progressions. He descended toward the most crowded intersection his perception could identify, seeking information through observation. His black dress shoes touched concrete at 4:37 in the afternoon, local time, making contact with the pedestrian plaza they called Times Square. The landing generated no physical impact, but cursed energy interaction with this dimension's fundamental forces sent electromagnetic shockwaves through every sensor within 5 miles. Traffic signals flickered and died. Smartphone screens displayed static. Electronic infrastructure experienced cascading disruption as foreign physics collided with Earth 616's technological foundation. Gojō straightened to his full 6 feet 3 inches, white hair falling across his face in the absence of his blindfold. His eyes tracked everything within enhanced perception range. Brilliant blue irises, brighter than human genetics permitted. The crowd consisted of baseline humans. Mostly, though, his six eyes detected anomalies. One woman possessed genetic mutations at the cellular level. A man near the subway entrance radiated trace amounts of gamma radiation that should have been lethal. Whatever world this was, it didn't conform to the biological standards he'd expected. Cursed energy continued bleeding from his body. In waves unconscious emission he couldn't suppress while his six eyes calibrated against this reality's baseline. To anyone monitoring with enhanced detection, Gojō registered as a singularity point source of energy that defied classification. Not magical by this world's definitions, not mutant in the genetic sense, not cosmic in origin. simply present occupying space in a universe lacking any framework to contain what he represented. 300 miles overhead aboard the Sehield helicarrier alarm cascades transformed the command center into organized chaos. Director Maria Hill watched every analytical system attempt and fail to classify the anomaly manifesting in Midtown Manhattan. The energy signature refused spectrum analysis. Output measurements produced self-contradicting readings with each successive scan. Particle detectors registered matter types that shouldn't exist according to the standard model. Space-time monitoring equipment, originally developed for tracking Asgardian Bifrost arrivals, displayed distortion patterns suggesting localized manipulation of dimensional constants themselves. In Malibu, an automated alert interrupted Tony Stark mid-calculation on repulsor efficiency improvements. Jarvis classified the anomaly as Priority Alpha before Stark accessed the data stream preliminary assessment, scrolling across holographic displays in urgent red. Unknown energy type detected. No database match. Recommended action: immediate investigation. Satellite imagery showed Times Square the figure at the distortion's epicenter, standing motionless while crowds retreated to form an expanding perimeter. Stark pulled up sensor feeds, watching the arrival moment replay across multiple spectrums. The individual at the center wasn't generating energy through technological means or obvious biological processes. The emission appeared passive, involuntary, as though existing in this dimension produced the radiation as unavoidable byproduct. In Greenwich Village's Sanctum Sanctorum, Dr. Stephen Strange felt the disturbance as physical sensation across his skin, like fingernails dragging through reality's fabric. He'd been practicing Vishanti geometric defenses in his meditation chamber when the weave of magic rippled with interference patterns. The spell structure collapsed instantly. Strange's eyes opened the Eye of Agamotto, beginning its defensive glow against his chest. He moved through corridors that shifted to accommodate his path, ascending to his observation chamber, where crystalline instruments tracked dimensional stability across the eastern seaboard. Every array displayed identical impossible readings. A knot in local space-time centered on Manhattan, radiating something that made magical energy behave erratically within expanding radius. Strange traced sigils that formed scrying portals, observing the source directly. The figure wasn't casting spells or wielding artifacts. The distortion emerged from simple presence from existing in this dimension. Strange recognized the pattern immediately. Not someone using power, someone made of power whose existence itself proved incompatible with Earth 616's baseline reality. The implications threatened everything from mirror dimension stability to barriers restraining entities like Dormammu. In Times Square, Gojō processed the tactical situation. Police established perimeter positions at cautious distance, waiting for reinforcements. Helicopters circled overhead rotors, creating downdrafts that Infinity filtered automatically. His 6 eyes tracked 12 officers with conventional firearms. 3 individuals in surrounding buildings with enhanced physiology, multiple scanning devices attempting sensor penetration without success. And something else approaching from the southwest at supersonic velocity, its energy signature bright enough to perceive through this world's ambient radiation static. The cursed energy continued its involuntary emission, bleeding into Earth 616's reality, like foreign substance introduced into a closed system. Gojō stood perfectly still, expression neutral. Infinity shimmering around him in patterns visible to enhanced perception as the distortion in space itself. Above Manhattan, sensor networks tracked the anomaly through every available spectrum. In underground bunkers, automated systems calculated threat assessments and escalation protocols. In laboratories across 3 continents, scientists stared at impossible data that contradicted fundamental assumptions about physics and energy. In hidden sanctums, mystics felt the weave of magic straining under unprecedented stress. And in the spaces between dimensions, in the eternal darkness of the dark dimension itself, something ancient and vast stirred with sudden interest. Dormammu's attention, which had been focused on schemes spanning millennia, pivoted toward Earth 616 with the focused intensity of a predator detecting wounded prey. The cursed energy signature carried flavors of negativity and suffering. His arcane senses found intoxicating structured in ways that bypassed the Vishanti's protective frameworks entirely. The barriers between dimensions began experiencing strain they weren't designed to withstand. Telepaths at Xavier's school felt pressure against their thoughts. Sorcerers at Kamartaj sensed heat against their spirits. Every sensitive consciousness on Earth registered the sensation of cosmic attention focusing on New York with terrible purpose. In the Sanctum Sanctorum, Strange's instruments went berserk simultaneously. Every warning system activated at once, displaying catastrophic weakening of dimensional barriers near the anomaly site. The Sorcerer Supreme's hands moved through defensive spell patterns on pure instinct, though he knew reinforcement might already be futile. Back in Times Square, Gojo's 6 eyes detected the shift. Something massive and ancient pressing against reality from outside, drawn by cursed energy resonance like a predator following blood in water. The sensation reminded him of special-grade curses from his world, but magnified beyond reasonable scale. This wasn't a curse. This was something that existed on a level where cities became irrelevant and planets served as toys. Across Earth, 616's defensive networks, alerts reached critical thresholds simultaneously. In the Avengers Tower, automated systems triggered emergency assembly protocols. At the Baxter Building, Reed Richards looked up from his calculations, with expression shifting to alarm. In Westchester, Xavier's cerebral enhancer registered psychic disruption patterns that suggested dimensional incursion imminent. The superhuman community of Earth 616 began mobilizing toward Manhattan, drawn by alerts that classified the situation as potential Omega-level threat, requiring immediate coordinated response. Gojo Satoru stood at the center of the growing maelstrom, unaware that his simple arrival had triggered cascading failures across multiple systems of protection that had safeguarded this reality for centuries. His infinity continued its automatic function, protecting him from a world that his very existence was beginning to unravel. The mathematics of Limitless operated flawlessly, subdividing space between him and all potential threats into infinite series that could never be traversed. But the technique's perfection was itself the problem. Every microsecond, infinity remained active. It carved deeper incompatibility into Earth 616's fundamental structure, creating wounds in reality that would take far more than his departure to heal. The alert reached priority channels across every superhuman organization simultaneously. In space stations and underwater facilities, in mountain fortresses and Arctic bunkers, in dimensions adjacent and realms mystical, those who served as Earth's defenders received the same urgent message. Unknown entity manifested Manhattan. Energy signature unclassified. Dimensional stability compromised. Threat assessment pending. All available assets respond immediately. The strongest of Earth 616 began converging on New York. Moving toward the white-haired figure who stood alone in Times Square, surrounded by infinity's shimmer, waiting to see what this strange new world would do with the walking catastrophe that had fallen into its midst. Captain Marvel arrived first, her form blazing with photon energy as she decelerated from Mach 3 to hovering stillness in the span of 2 seconds. Carol Danvers floated 60 feet above Times Square, blonde hair streaming behind her, assessing the white-haired figure who stood motionless at ground level. The energy readings her enhanced senses detected made no sense whatsoever. Not radiation in any conventional spectrum, not psionic emanation, not cosmic power signature. Something entirely outside her frame of reference, pouring from the individual like heat from a star. She'd been over the Atlantic on routine patrol when the priority Alpha alert came through, flagged as potential Omega-level threat, requiring immediate superhero response. Now studying the scene below, she wasn't sure whether the threat assessment was accurate or catastrophically understated. The figure appeared humanoid male, wearing what looked like casual civilian clothing. But the distortion surrounding him bent light at impossible angles, and her cosmic awareness screamed warnings about fundamental wrongness in the space he occupied. Thunder announced Thor's arrival before the god of thunder himself appeared descending from storm clouds that hadn't existed 30 seconds earlier. Mjolnir crackled with residual lightning as he took position on Carol's left flank, his expression grave. The Asgardian had sensed the disturbance from his quarters in Avengers Tower, felt it as pressure against senses attuned to cosmic forces and mystical energies. Whatever stood below them carried power that made his divine heritage react with instinctive wariness. Iron Man came third, repulsors flaring as Tony Stark's armor decelerated from supersonic approach. His faceplate retracted immediately, revealing features tight with concentration as holographic displays flooded his field of vision with data streams. Jarvis was running continuous analysis on the target, attempting pattern recognition across every known energy type in the database. Every scan came back with variations of the same frustrating result: undefined, unclassified, incompatible with existing models. Captain America arrived at street level aboard his motorcycle, the engine's growl cutting through the ambient city noise as he brought the vehicle to a stop behind police barricades. Steve Rogers dismounted with practiced efficiency, shield already in hand, taking in the tactical situation with the analytical eye of a soldier who'd seen too many battlefields. Civilians evacuated perimeter, established unknown individual at center, showing no obvious hostile intent, but radiating energy that made every instrument within visual range malfunction. The Avengers formed a loose containment formation around Gojō, not quite aggressive, but clearly prepared for combat escalation. Tony spoke first, his suit's external speakers carrying his voice across the distance with electronic clarity. Need you to identify yourself and explain what you're doing in New York. Gojo's 6 eyes tracked the 4 individuals with enhanced perception that mapped every detail simultaneously. The woman wreathed in cosmic energy, operating at power levels that suggested access to forces beyond normal human limitation. The armored man, his suit a marvel of engineering powered by some kind of miniaturized reactor that shouldn't be physically possible. The one with the hammer radiating energy signatures that his inherited sight recognized as fundamentally different from cursed energy or human biology. The super soldier, his enhanced physiology pushed to absolute human peak through methods Gojō couldn't immediately identify. All of them strong by the standards of normal humans. None of them capable of touching him through infinity. He remained silent, calculating. His Japanese wouldn't be understood here, and attempting communication might escalate the situation before he understood the context. Better to observe to let them make the first move while his 6 eyes gathered intelligence about their capabilities and intentions. Carol interpreted the silence as potential hostility. She descended slowly, hands visible but energy levels rising as her body prepared for combat. The atmospheric distortion around the target intensified as she approached, and she felt resistance in the space itself, as though the air had become thick as molasses in a sphere around the white-haired individual. Thor raised Mjolnir not in attack, but in warning. Lightning crawled across the hammer's surface, casting blue-white illumination across the darkening square. He called upon the storm, letting the sky speak his intent. Thunder rolling across Manhattan as clouds gathered overhead with unnatural speed. The display had exactly the opposite effect from what Thor intended. Gojo's infinity reacted to the sudden spike in atmospheric electricity, its automatic defense protocols interpreting the gathering charge as potential threat. The technique expanded its range from 30 feet to 50, creating a zone where space itself subdivided into infinite series, slowing all motion and energy transfer towards zero velocity. Thor's lightning, when it came, moved at a fraction of light speed initially. But as it entered infinity's sphere of influence, the bolt's progression decelerated exponentially. What should have crossed 50 feet in microseconds instead took 3 full seconds crawling through the air like molten glass, its energy bleeding away into the infinite subdivisions of space between origin and target. By the time it reached 5 feet from Gojo's position, the lightning had slowed to walking pace, hanging suspended in midair like a photograph of thunder. The Avengers tensed immediately. Carol's photon energy flared bright. Tony's repulsors charged to maximum output. Steve's shield came up to defensive position. Whatever technique the unknown individual had just used to stop Thor's lightning represented capabilities they hadn't anticipated. Gojō, for his part, hadn't moved. Infinity operated automatically, requiring no conscious effort to maintain. But he recognized that the display of defensive capability had been interpreted as aggression, and the tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Carol made her decision. She accelerated directly at the target, building momentum from 0 to several hundred miles per hour in less than a second, intending to close distance and establish physical containment before weapons came into play. Her body, enhanced by the psyche magnetron and capable of withstanding the void of space, should have crossed the distance effortlessly. Should have. At 20 feet from Gojo's position, her velocity began decreasing without explanation. At 15 feet, she was moving as though through water. At 10 feet, the resistance became nearly solid space itself, refusing to permit her approach. She pushed harder, channeling more cosmic energy into forward momentum, but the mathematics worked against her. Infinity subdivided the remaining distance into infinite series. She could always move forward, but she could never arrive. The frustration on her face was visible as she hung there suspended 15 feet from the target, unable to advance or retreat easily. Her photon energy blazed brighter, and that's when Gojō made his mistake. He instinctively activated blue to create distance, not realizing how the technique would appear to observers who couldn't perceive cursed energy directly. A sphere of attractive force manifested 8 feet to Carol's right, its pull sudden and overwhelming. The woman in the cosmic energy aura was yanked sideways, pulled toward the focal point with acceleration that slammed her into the pavement hard enough to crack concrete. Simultaneously, every loose object within 30 yards began accelerating toward the same point. Street signs tore free from posts. Fragments of sidewalk lifted into the air. A parked vehicle's tires screeched as it slid across asphalt metal, groaning under the strain. To the Avengers, it appeared as though their teammate had been attacked with some kind of gravitational weapon. Tony's repulsors fired immediately, twin beams of concentrated energy lancing toward the target. The repulsor blasts entered Infinity's sphere of influence and suffered the same fate as Thor's lightning, slowing to crawl. As they approached, their energy dissipating harmlessly. Steve threw his shield with perfect technique, the vibranium disc spinning through the air on trajectory calculated to ricochet off the target and return. The shield made it within 12 feet before Infinity's automatic defense caught it, slowing the disc to stationary hover, like a paused video frame. Gojō canceled blue the moment he realized his error, and Carol shot back into the air, her expression shifting from surprised to genuinely angry. The situation had officially crossed from containment to combat, and he hadn't intended any of it. Thor descended rapidly. Mjolnir raised for a physical strike that would carry the full force of Asgardian strength. The hammer entered Infinity's range and slowed like everything else. But Thor's divine power continued pushing, forcing motion through sheer overwhelming output. The hammer advanced inches where Carol's cosmic power had been completely stopped, and Gojo's 6 eyes perceived the difference immediately. This one commanded forces that operated on principles closer to jujutsu than physical energy. Before Thor could close the remaining distance, golden light tore a circle in the air 20 feet from the conflict. Sparks traced geometric patterns as a portal opened, and Dr. Stephen Strange stepped through his cloak of levitation. Billowing dramatically, the eye of Agamotto gleaming against his chest. His voice carried absolute authority. "Stand down, Avengers, immediately!" The command froze everyone in place through sheer force of respect for the Sorcerer Supreme's judgment. Tony's repulsors powered to standby. Thor halted Mjolnir's advance, though the hammer remained ready. Carol descended to ground level, her energy levels still elevated, watching the white-haired figure warily. Strange approached Gojō slowly. Hands visible and moving through patterns the 6 eyes recognized as structured technique. He spoke in English first, then something shifted in his voice, harmonics entering that transcended normal human vocal range. Translation magic, crude but functional. "You're causing a panic. These people are trying to protect their city, not harm you. Can you understand me?" Gojō nodded. Once relief flooding through him at finally encountering someone who understood the concept of communication across dimensional barriers. He spoke in Japanese, trusting the magic to carry intent. "I don't know where I am." Strange received the response, parsed it understood. "You're not from this universe at all, are you?" Another nod. The Sorcerer Supreme turned to face the Avengers, his expression grave. He's not hostile. He's displaced, probably doesn't even understand what just happened. That defensive technique around him is automatic, not aggressive. And that gravitational effect wasn't an attack, it was instinct. Tony's faceplate retracted. Strange that instinct just put Carol through a sidewalk. "I'm aware," Strange replied. "But if he'd wanted her harmed, she'd be dead. That much I can sense." He turned back to Gojō, maintaining the translation spell. "I need you to come with me somewhere we can talk, without endangering thousands of bystanders. Will you cooperate?" Gojō studied the robed man's energy signature, the genuine concern behind the request, the absence of deception. He nodded a third time. Strange opened another portal, this one leading to neutral ground far from population centers. Gojō stepped through without hesitation, and the Sorcerer Supreme followed the golden gateway closing behind them. The Avengers stood in Times Square staring at the space where 2 individuals had vanished. The silence stretched for several seconds before Tony broke it, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. "Jarvis analysis." The AI's response came immediately through Tony's internal speakers. "The energy signature has departed, sir. However, I have concluded that our previous threat assessment was insufficient. If that individual had chosen to engage seriously, I calculate 78% probability of catastrophic casualties before containment could be achieved." Carol descended fully to street level, rolling her shoulders as enhanced physiology rapidly healed the bruises from her impact with the pavement. "He pulled me like I was nothing. I've gone toe-to-toe with Thanos. That shouldn't be possible." "And yet it was." Thor rumbled, lowering Mjolnir but keeping the weapon ready. "That one's power operates outside Asgardian understanding. The All-Father should be informed of this encounter." Steve approached the spot where his shield had hung suspended in mid-air, now resting on the cracked pavement. He retrieved the vibranium disc, examining it for damage that wasn't there. The metal showed no stress marks, no indication it had been subjected to any force at all. He didn't hurt us. Could have clearly had the capability, but didn't. That defensive technique stopped everything we threw at him, but he never went truly offensive. Because Strange interrupted, Tony countered his engineer's mind, already running tactical scenarios. Or because he was evaluating threats before committing to lethal force. Holographic displays materialized around him as he pulled up satellite footage replaying the moment Gojō had activated Blue. This gravitational ability doesn't register on any sensor until it's already active. No energy buildup, no charge signature, no warning. That's terrifying from a tactical standpoint. Carol looked toward Greenwich Village, where Strange had taken the unknown individual through his portal. So what do we do? Track them down. Demand answers. We wait. Steve decided his tactical mind weighing options with the experience of decades leading superhuman operations. Strange wouldn't protect a genuine threat to civilian safety. The man's judgment has been sound on matters like this before. But we monitor this situation closely. His expression was troubled as he looked at the suspended lightning bolt that was only now fully dissipating. Whatever that individual is, he just demonstrated power that puts him in a very dangerous category. Tony's arc reactor pulsed as Jarvis compiled preliminary threat assessment in real time. Agreed. I'm flagging this as priority alpha in our database. If he shows up again anywhere on Earth, I want every available Avenger on standby. And I'm sending the encounter data to Reed Richards. If anyone can figure out what kind of physics that defensive field operates on, it's him. Thor studied the cracked pavement where Carol had impacted his divine senses, still processing what they'd witnessed. The lightning I called upon carried the full fury of the storm. It should have struck with force sufficient to fell a giant. Yet his barrier rendered it harmless without apparent effort. Such power suggests either tremendous natural ability or mastery that comes from centuries of refinement. He didn't look centuries old, Carol observed. Late 20s at most, which means if he's that powerful already. She didn't need to finish the thought. They all understood the implication. If someone that young commanded that level of capability, what would he be like? With decades more experience, Tony's systems flagged incoming communication from CILD Maria Hill, demanding immediate debrief on the Times Square incident. I'll handle the bureaucratic cleanup. Steve, you coordinate with local law enforcement. Make sure no one got seriously hurt in the evacuation. Carol, Thor, run perimeter sweep in case there are any other anomalies we missed. The Avengers dispersed to their assigned tasks, each carrying the weight of an encounter that had demonstrated just how vast the gap could be between Earth's defenders and truly unknown threats. In the hours that followed, encrypted communications would flow between superhuman organizations worldwide, spreading word of the white-haired anomaly who'd made the planet's mightiest heroes hesitate. In Shield databases, new files were created and classified at the highest security levels. Analysis teams would spend days dissecting every second of footage, trying to understand the principles behind techniques that violated known physics. Threat assessment models would be revised upward 3 times as the full implications became clear. And in the sanctum sanctorum, Strange would begin the difficult process of explaining to a displaced sorcerer from another reality that his very existence in this dimension might represent the greatest threat Earth 616 had ever faced. The game had moved from first contact to active crisis, and none of the players yet understood just how high the stakes would climb. The portal deposited them in a chamber that existed between dimensions. A pocket of reality Strange had carved from the mirrored dimension for exactly these kinds of situations. The architecture defied conventional geometry walls, meeting at angles that shouldn't be possible staircases ascending in directions that had no correlation to up or down. Gojo's six eyes struggled momentarily to parse the space before adapting his inherited perception, mapping the impossible topology through pure mathematical comprehension. Strange wasted no time on pleasantries. His hands moved through complex patterns, golden light tracing sigils that hung in the air like frozen fire. The translation magic remained active, allowing communication to flow, as conceptual understanding rather than words. Around them, the mirror dimension's malleable reality responded to the Sorcerer Supreme's will, isolating this pocket further from Earth proper. The precaution was necessary. Every second Gojō spent near populated areas, his cursed energy emission carved deeper incompatibilities into Earth 616's fundamental structure. Strange needed to understand the mechanics before the damage became irreversible, needed to determine whether this dimensional refugee could be helped or whether more drastic measures would prove necessary. He began with diagnostic spells, weaving detection enchantments that had been refined over centuries of mystical practice. The first spell attempted to read Gojo's energy signature, the way it would read any magical practitioner mapping the flow and structure of power through established frameworks. The enchantment collapsed the moment it touched cursed energy, its carefully balanced equations, encountering variables that didn't exist in any magical tradition, Strange knew. The failure was immediate and spectacular. Golden light flickered, stuttered, then fragmented into pieces that dissolved into nothing. Strange's expression tightened. He'd seen spells fail before, but never quite like this. Not rejection or resistance, but incompatibility at the most fundamental level, as though the magic itself couldn't comprehend what it was trying to analyze. He tried again with different approaches. Spells derived from the Vishanti's teachings. Enchantments borrowed from the Book of Cagliostro detection methods, taught in Camartage, that predated written language. Each attempt produced the same result: contact confusion collapse. The cursed energy wasn't blocking the magic. It was simply operating under laws that Marvel's mystical framework had no method to process. Gojō watched the repeated failures with growing unease. His six eyes perceived the structure of Strange's techniques, recognized them as sophisticated manipulation of forces similar to but distinct from cursed energy. In his world, sorcerers bent cursed energy to their will through inherited techniques and careful training. Here, this man commanded something else entirely. Something that carried weight and purpose, but followed completely different rules. Strange moved to more invasive testing. He opened a scrying window into Gojo's recent past, a spell that should have displayed the moments before the dimensional transfer as visual record. The window opened, flickered, then showed only static distortion. The magic couldn't parse the cursed energy interactions that had caused the initial rupture. To Earth 616's mystical framework, those events were gibberish data that couldn't be decoded because the encryption method didn't exist in this reality's mathematical space. The Sorcerer Supreme closed the failed scrying window and turned his attention to larger implications. He traced broader diagnostic patterns, examining how Gojo's presence affected the ambient magical energy in the chamber. The results confirmed his worst suspicions. Cursed energy didn't just fail to integrate with Marvel's magic. It actively disrupted it, creating zones of interference where spells behaved erratically or failed to function at all. Within 10 feet of Gojō, enchantments lost cohesion. Protective wards became unreliable. The weave of magic that connected all mystical practitioners on Earth showed strain patterns radiating from his position. It was like introducing a magnetic field into precision electronic equipment. The systems didn't break immediately, but their operation degraded in ways that would cascade into catastrophic failure, given enough time. Strange spoke carefully, maintaining the translation magic. You're not from a parallel Earth. You're from outside the entire local dimensional cluster. Your energy operates on principles that don't exist here. Gojō absorbed this information through the magical translation understanding clicking into place. Not just another country or hidden realm, but an entirely separate reality with its own physics. The sinking sensation in his chest deepened. If cursed energy didn't exist here, if the fundamental forces were different, how could he possibly return home? Strange continued his analysis, expanding perception beyond the immediate chamber. His awareness touched the boundaries between dimensions, feeling for stress points and weaknesses. What he found made his blood run cold. The dark dimension, which should have been sealed behind multiple layers of protective barriers, was pressing against Earth's reality with unprecedented force. The cursed energy emission was acting like a beacon, drawing attention from entities that existed in the spaces between universes. The barriers were holding, but they were weakening. Each minute Gojō spent in Earth 616, cursed energy interacted with the dimensional boundaries in ways that made them more permeable. Strange could feel Dormammu's attention focusing on Earth with the intensity of a predator that had caught scent of wounded prey. The entity's consciousness, vast and ancient, was drawn to the cursed energy's signature of crystallized negativity and suffering. To Dormammu, cursed energy represented something novel and potentially useful. It carried the flavor of dark emotions, similar to the negative energies he fed upon, but structured in ways that bypassed the Vishanti's protective frameworks entirely. The entity couldn't consume it directly through the dimensional barriers, but he was increasingly interested in acquiring either the energy source itself or the individual who carried it. Strange felt the shift happening in real time. The dark dimension's pressure against Earth's reality increased from passive observation to active probing. Dormammu was testing the barriers, searching for weaknesses, motivated now by genuine desire rather than casual curiosity. The situation had moved from concerning to critical in the span of minutes. Gojo's 6 eyes detected the change as well, perceiving massive pressure building against reality from outside. The sensation reminded him of how special-grade curses manifested their domains, but magnified beyond any scale he'd encountered. Whatever entity was pressing against this world operated on a level that made cities irrelevant. This wasn't a fight he could win through superior technique or overwhelming power. This was something that existed in a weight class he'd never imagined possible. Strange made his decision. He opened a broader scrying portal, showing Gojō visual representation of what the Sorcerer Supreme could perceive mystically. The dark dimension appeared as roiling chaos, pressed against a thin film of protective barriers, and at its center, a consciousness of terrible magnitude focused its full attention on Earth. The translation magic carried Strange's next words with absolute clarity. That is Dormammu, ruler of the dark dimension, conqueror of countless realities. Your presence here has attracted his attention. If you remain on Earth, he will eventually break through the barriers, and millions will die in the invasion that follows. Gojō stared at the scrying image, his expression neutral, but his mind calculating rapidly. The entity represented a threat beyond anything he could counter directly. His techniques were powerful, possibly powerful enough to survive an encounter, but not to win. Not against something that size, that ancient, that fundamentally beyond his operational framework. Strange continued his tone careful. I need you to leave Earth. Find somewhere in the dimensional void where your energy won't attract attention, somewhere uninhabited, where the damage you cause won't matter. I can open a portal to such a location, but you must go quickly. The translation magic carried Gojo's response back. I don't understand what's happening. I need time to think. And Strange's expression tightened with frustration. They didn't have time. Every second of delay gave Dormammu more opportunity to exploit the weakening barriers. But he also recognized genuine confusion in the white-haired sorcerer's words. This individual was powerful, but lost displaced into circumstances he couldn't have anticipated. Before Strange could respond, the temperature in the chamber dropped 40 degrees in an instant. Frost formed on surfaces that shouldn't be capable of freezing. The ambient light took on a reddish cast as reality itself began showing strain. Through the chamber's walls, through the layers of protective magic, Strange had woven through the very fabric of the mirror dimension. Itself a presence began manifesting. Dormammu wasn't attempting full invasion yet. He was testing extending a fragment of his consciousness through the weakened barriers to investigate the cursed energy source more directly. The avatar that began taking shape in the chamber was barely a fraction of the entity's true power, but it filled the space with pressure that made breathing difficult. The manifestation appeared as shadow and flame, a humanoid outline composed of dark dimension matter that shouldn't be able to exist in Earth's reality without immediately dissipating. But cursed energy's presence created zones where the normal rules didn't apply consistently, allowing the avatar temporary stability. Strange's hands blazed with defensive magic, immediately golden shields forming between the avatar and both sorcerers. The Sorcerer Supreme understood the severity of this moment. If Dormammu could manifest avatars this easily, already the barriers were degrading faster than his worst projections. Gojo's Infinity activated to maximum range automatically, perceiving the avatar as hostile threat. His 6 eyes mapped the entity's structure, finding composition that defied physical laws. Not cursed spirit, not human, not any classification his inherited sight had categories for. Simply alien, operating on principles that existed orthogonal to everything he understood. The avatar didn't attack immediately. It simply observed, studying both sorcerers with attention that felt like weight pressing against consciousness. When it finally spoke, the voice resonated through dimensions, without regard for the concept of sound. Fascinating. A source of crystallized suffering that exists outside the Vishanti's framework. Tell me, sorcerer of the empty void, do you understand what you carry? Do you comprehend how delectable your essence appears to entities that feed on negative emotions? Neither Gojō nor Strange responded verbally. Both maintained defensive postures, calculating odds and strategies. The avatar continued its attention, focusing primarily on Gojō now. I will claim you, eventually white-haired one. Your energy calls to the dark dimension like a signal fire. You cannot hide from me while you remain in this reality. Surrender now, and I promise your students will be spared when I consume your world. The threat to his students pierced Gojo's usual composure like nothing else could. His cursed energy output spiked involuntarily, and for just a moment, the avatar recoiled from the intensity. But the damage was done. The mention of students, the threat against those he'd sworn to protect, had revealed information Gojō desperately didn't want an enemy of this magnitude to possess. Strange felt the barrier between dimensions crack further under the strain of increased cursed energy emission. Dormammu's avatar flickered, but didn't dissipate, holding its manifestation through sheer overwhelming power. The Sorcerer Supreme made a split-second decision. He wove a banishment spell with both hands, channeling energy directly from the eye of Agamotto. Golden light blazed bright enough to wash out all other colors, and the mystical backlash struck the avatar with force sufficient to shatter its temporary stability. The dark dimension manifestation dissolved back into fragments that retreated through the cracks in reality. But as it departed, Dormammu's voice echoed through the chamber one final time. I will return for what is mine, Strange, and when I do, your precious earth will burn. The barriers sealed themselves, reinforced by Strange's will and the eye's power. The temperature began rising back toward normal. Frost melted. The oppressive presence faded. But both sorcerers understood what had just transpired. Dormammu knew about Gojō now, knew about the cursed energy, knew it represented something he wanted to possess. And nothing short of complete dimensional isolation would prevent the entity from pursuing that goal. Strange turned to face Gojō, translation magic still active, his expression grave. Now you understand. Now you cannot remain here. Not without bringing catastrophe. Gojo's response came after a long silence. Where would I go, and how would I return to protect my students? I don't know, Strange admitted. But if you stay, Dormammu will break through. And when he does, there won't be any students left for you to protect anywhere in this dimension or yours. The chamber fell silent, except for the sound of reality gradually stabilizing after the Avatar's departure. Two powerful individuals, both accustomed to being the strongest in their respective worlds, both confronting a situation that neither could solve through force alone. Outside the mirror dimension chamber, across Earth 616, every mystically sensitive individual felt the aftershocks of Dormammu's attempted manifestation. Barriers had been tested and found wanting. The dark dimension had proven it could reach through to Earth, given sufficient motivation. And in the eternal darkness beyond reality's edge, Dormammu smiled his terrible smile and began planning his invasion in earnest. The game had moved from curiosity to active pursuit. The white-haired sorcerer with his fascinating energy would be claimed. It was only a matter of time. Strange had transported him to an abandoned warehouse district in New Jersey, far enough from Manhattan's population density that cursed energy emission wouldn't immediately endanger civilians. The Sorcerer Supreme departed through another portal with promises to research dimensional transfer methods, leaving Gojō alone in a world he didn't understand, with problems he couldn't solve through superior strength. He spent the first hour simply walking his six eyes, mapping the unfamiliar city, while his mind worked through implications. Dormammu's threat against his students replayed constantly. In his absence, Yuji and Megumi and Nobara would be vulnerable to curse users who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. But returning home meant risking dimensional catastrophe that could destroy both worlds. The mathematics of the situation offered no clean solutions. His wandering brought him to the industrial outskirts, where factories stood silent in the evening darkness. The area felt wrong to his enhanced perception tension, saturating the atmosphere like ozone before lightning. His six eyes detected three signatures moving through the shadows between buildings, their energy patterns suggesting youth and fear in equal measure. Enhanced physiology marked them as different from baseline humans, similar to the anomalies he'd noticed in Times Square. Then he felt the pursuers. Massive signatures approaching from multiple vectors, mechanical in origin, but radiating purpose that suggested directed intelligence. Gojō moved toward the conflict without conscious decision, his teacher's instinct overriding concerns about dimensional incompatibility. He arrived at the confrontation site to find three teenagers cornered against a warehouse wall. Two girls and a boy, none older than 16, by his estimation, their terror visible even in the dim industrial lighting. The boy's hands sparked with uncontrolled electrical discharge. One girl's skin had taken on metallic sheen, her breathing rapid with panic. The other girl seemed to be phasing partially out of reality, her form flickering like bad video signal. Facing them stood three machines that Gojo's six eyes categorized immediately as combat units. Each stood 35 feet tall, humanoid in basic configuration, but built with obvious hostile purpose. purple and white color schemes, weapon systems integrated into their frames, sensor arrays tracking the teenagers with mechanical precision. Sentinel marked techs units, though Gojō didn't know their designation, only that they were hunting children. The central Sentinel's speakers activated with electronic voice that carried no emotion. Mutant targets confirmed, unregistered and displaying powers beyond approved threshold. Retrieval protocol authorized by Office of National Emergency. Surrender for processing or be subdued. The phasing girl tried to run her body, flickering more severely as panic overwhelmed control. The Sentinel's hand blurred forward with speed that shouldn't be possible for something that size, mechanical fingers closing around her partially solid form. She screamed, the sound cutting through Gojo's hesitation like a blade. Infinity activated automatically as he moved his body, crossing the distance between observation point and confrontation in less than a second. The Sentinel didn't register his approach until he was already within striking range, his cursed energy signature too foreign for its sensors to classify as threat. The machine's head turned toward him, optical sensors attempting analysis. Gojō didn't give it time to complete the scan. Blue manifested at a point 6 feet behind the Sentinel's center of mass attractive force building, instantly from 0 to 200,000 pounds. The robot's structural integrity, designed to withstand high-caliber munitions, proved insufficient against spatial manipulation that treated mass as suggestion rather than law. The Sentinel jerked backward, metal shrieking, as components never meant to experience that kind of stress twisted out of alignment. Its grip on the phasing girl loosened enough for her to tear free, stumbling away from the collapsing machine. Gojō canceled blue before the attractive force pulled the teenagers into danger, his 6 eyes tracking all variables simultaneously. The other 2 Sentinels responded with programmed efficiency weapon systems activating in coordination. Plasma cannons charged and fired twin beams of superheated matter lancing toward the white-haired individual who'd just destroyed their companion unit. The plasma entered Infinity's sphere of influence and experienced the same fate as Thor's lightning velocity, decreasing exponentially until the burning projectiles hung motionless in midair. Gojo's expression remained neutral, but his mind raced through tactical calculations. These machines were hunting children for the crime of being different, being powerful, being unable to control abilities they'd never asked for. The parallel to cursed energy users in his world was exact. Jujutsu Society had its own methods for dealing with sorcerers who couldn't conform to established standards. He'd spent his entire teaching career fighting against that system. The second Sentinel attempted physical engagement, its massive frame accelerating with shocking speed for something weighing 85 tons. Mechanical fist drove toward Gojo's position with enough force to pulverize concrete. The strike entered Infinity's range and slowed to crawl the robot's momentum, bleeding away into infinite subdivisions of space. Gojō made his decision. These machines represented exactly the kind of systemized oppression he'd dedicated his life to dismantling. The fact that he was in a different universe didn't change the fundamental equation. Children were being hunted by a system that feared what it couldn't control. He activated a fragment of unlimited void, not the full domain that would flood minds with infinite information, but a compressed version that could target mechanical intelligence. The domain manifested as sphere of warped space around the second Sentinel, 20 feet in diameter. Reality inside taking on the particular wrongness that characterized his innate technique at maximum output. The Sentinel's processing systems, designed to handle complex tactical scenarios and rapid threat assessment, encountered input that transcended their operational parameters. Infinite data streams flooded sensor arrays in the span of microseconds. Combat protocols tried parsing information that had no endpoint, no resolution, no achievable calculation. The machine's electronic consciousness, such as it was, experienced something analogous to sensory overload, that human minds suffered under unlimited void's full effect. Smoke began pouring from the Sentinel's cranial unit. Its limbs locked in place as motor control systems crashed, attempting to process impossible commands. Internal circuits overheated, unable to dissipate the thermal load of computational processes running in infinite loop. The robot collapsed 35 feet of advanced military technology reduced to expensive scrap metal. The third Sentinel attempted to retreat its threat assessment algorithms, concluding that survival superseded mission completion. It made it 15 yards before Blue caught it, attractive force yanking the machine backward and upward. Gojō held the technique for 3 seconds, metal groaning as the Sentinel hung suspended 20 feet above ground. Then he released it. The robot fell, and the impact shattered concrete beneath its mass. Internal gyros tried compensating for the sudden direction change, but succeeded only in twisting the frame further out of alignment. The Sentinel attempted to rise servos, whining with effort, but critical systems had been damaged beyond field repair capacity. Gojō stood among the wreckage of 3 Sentinel Mark X units, his breathing unchanged. Infinity still shimmering around him in barely visible distortion. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 40 seconds. He turned to face the 3 teenagers who stared at him with expressions mixing terror and desperate hope. The boy with electrical powers spoke first, his voice shaking. "Are you going to hurt us?" Gojō understood the question, despite linguistic barriers, the fear behind it translating clearly through tone and body language. He shook his head slowly, then gestured for them to follow. Whatever else happened, whatever consequences this intervention created, he wouldn't leave these children to be hunted by machines that saw them as problems requiring containment. The teenagers exchanged glances, silent communication passing between them. The metallic-skinned girl took the first step forward, and the others followed. They walked past the destroyed Sentinels, past the smoking wreckage of government property, worth millions, following a white-haired stranger who'd just demonstrated power beyond anything their hunted existence had prepared them for. Across New York and New Jersey, Office of National Emergency Monitoring Systems registered catastrophic loss of Sentinel units during routine mutant retrieval operation. Priority alerts cascaded through command structures, flagging the engagement for immediate analysis. Satellite footage began uploading to secure servers. Analysts preparing to identify the individual responsible for destroying 3 Mark X units with apparent ease. In Westchester, Xavier's cerebral enhancement detected the psychic shockwave of 3 young mutants' fear transforming into tentative hope. The professor's attention focused on the industrial district, perceiving the echo of power that his telepathy couldn't classify. Not mutant in the genetic sense, but operating on similar principles of reality manipulation that transcended normal human capability. At the Baxter Building, Reed Richards received automated notification that the anomaly from Times Square had engaged in hostile action against government assets. His brilliant mind immediately began calculating implications. If the unknown individual was defending mutants against ONE protocols, the political ramifications would be severe. The delicate balance between superhuman community and government authority was already strained. This would make everything worse. Gojō led the 3 teenagers through darkness, moving away from the engagement site before additional military assets arrived. His 6 eyes detected incoming aircraft from multiple directions, response teams mobilizing to investigate the Sentinel destruction. He needed to find shelter, needed time to figure out what he'd just involved himself in. But looking at the 3 young faces following him through the industrial night, seeing their gradual transition from terror to cautious trust, Gojō found himself unable to regret the intervention. This world might operate under different laws, might have different systems and different threats. But children being hunted for circumstances beyond their control remained children who needed protection. He'd become a teacher to prevent exactly this kind of systematic cruelty. Dimensional displacement didn't change that fundamental purpose. The electric boy spoke again as they walked. "My name is Marcus. This is Lynn and Sarah. We were just trying to get to the safe house when they found us." Gojō nodded, understanding the gist, if not the specific words. The boy continued talking, his voice gaining confidence. "You're like us, aren't you? Different? Powerful. That's why you helped us." Not exactly accurate, but close enough. Gojō nodded again. Sarah, the phasing girl, looked back at the distant glow where the destroyed sentinels still burned. "They're going to hunt you now. ONE doesn't forgive people who destroy their property, especially not their sentinels." Gojo's expression remained neutral, but his mind processed the information. He'd entered this world's conflict between enhanced individuals and government authority, made himself a target for forces he didn't understand. Strange would be furious. The situation was already complicated enough without adding political dimensions. But walking through the darkness with 3 teenagers who'd been marked for capture simply for existing differently, Gojō found that the cost-benefit analysis mattered less than the immediate moral calculus. These children needed protection. He had the power to provide it. Everything else could be addressed later. Behind them, military helicopters began arriving at the engagement site, searchlights cutting through the industrial night. Analysts would review the footage, identify the white-haired individual, flag him as priority threat. The Office of National Emergency would issue warrants, mobilize additional resources, coordinate with superhuman response teams. Gojo Satoru, teacher from another universe, entirely had just declared himself an enemy of Earth. Cécine's government through the simple act of protecting students. The irony wasn't lost on him. Some patterns remained consistent, regardless of dimensional boundaries. He led the 3 mutant teenagers deeper into the darkness, searching for somewhere safe, while alarms sounded behind them and the hunt began in earnest. Gojō found the location through systematic search over 3 days, his 6 eyes scanning abandoned industrial zones until he identified a structure that met his requirements. An old steel processing plant in rural Pennsylvania, defunct for 2 decades, isolated from population centers by 15 miles of forested terrain. The main building stretched across 4 acres, its interior gutted by salvage operations that had left only skeletal framework and concrete foundations. Perfect for renovation through spatial manipulation. He spent 2 days reshaping the facility using Limitless in ways he'd never attempted before. Blue created gravitational wells that pulled structural materials into precise configurations. Red provided the repulsive force necessary to bend steel beams without conventional tools. The work was exhausting in ways that combat never achieved, requiring sustained concentration and mathematical precision that pushed his 6 eyes to operational limits. The result was a structure that appeared abandoned from outside, but contained habitable space folded through dimensional manipulation. Rooms existed in configurations that violated Euclidean geometry, hallways connected at angles that created more interior volume than the external dimensions should permit. Not quite pocket dimension like Strange's mirror dimension, but close enough that casual observation couldn't map the facility's true extent. Marcus, Lynn, and Sarah watched the construction process with expressions mixing awe and confusion. They'd never witnessed this kind of casual reality manipulation, had spent their lives hiding abilities that seemed insignificant compared to the white-haired man who reshaped architecture through gesture and will. Word spread through the mutant underground with the speed that only desperate communities achieve. 3 teenagers rescued from Sentinel deployment, sheltered by unknown individual of tremendous power facility established outside government surveillance networks. The story grew, with each retelling details embellished until Gojō became mythical figure, rather than displaced teacher trying to help children who reminded him of his students. They arrived in small groups over the following weeks. A girl whose touch caused uncontrollable atomic decay exiled from her family after accidentally killing the family dog. Twin boys whose telepathic connection drove them slowly insane, without proper training in mental shielding. A teenager whose body generated toxic gas when stressed, forced to live isolated from all human contact. 17 mutant adolescents, total each carrying trauma from a world that feared what it couldn't control. Gojō approached their training with the same philosophy he developed at Tokyo Jujutsu High. Power wasn't curse or blessing, simply tool requiring proper understanding. The atomic decay girl, whom he mentally nicknamed Meltdown, for lack of shared language, learned to perceive her ability as controllable phenomenon rather than random catastrophe. He spent hours working with her, using his 6 eyes to map the energy patterns preceding her power's activation, teaching her to recognize the same warnings through awareness rather than suppression. The telepathic twins required different approach. Their minds leaked into each other constantly, boundaries eroding under pressure of connection. Neither understood how to manage. Gojō couldn't teach telepathy, had no experience with mental abilities beyond cursed technique application. But he understood the principle of controlled output versus uncontrolled flood. He taught them visualization exercises, mental frameworks for imagining their connection as valve they could adjust, rather than open floodgate. The toxic gas generator, a quiet boy who'd stopped speaking after his powers manifested, needed reassurance more than technique. Gojō sat with him daily infinity, providing absolute protection that let the boy relax without fear of harming someone. Trust built slowly, and with trust came control. The boy began speaking again after 2 weeks, his powers activating less frequently as anxiety decreased. The training philosophy attracted attention beyond the mutant underground. In Westchester, Xavier's cerebral enhancement detected the facility's existence through the collective consciousness of 17 young mutants whose emotional states had stabilized dramatically. The professor investigated his vast telepathic awareness, touching the minds of teenagers who previously radiated fear and self-loathing, but now showed growing confidence. The X-Men held council in the war room, holographic displays showing satellite imagery of the Pennsylvania facility. Its impossible interior dimensions were visible through thermal and electromagnetic scans, space-folding in ways that made Reed Richards' negative zone portal look conventional by comparison. Cyclops stood at the tactical display, his visor's ruby quartz gleaming as he analyzed the structure with military precision. 17 unregistered mutants in one location. If ONE discovers this facility, they'll classify it as terrorist cell and respond with overwhelming force. His finger traced approach vectors on the hologram, calculating how Sentinel deployment would proceed. We're looking at potential massacre. Storm's white hair lifted slightly as her emotional state affected local weather patterns, clouds forming over the mansion despite clear skies elsewhere. I'm more concerned about who's teaching them. Professor, that energy signature you detected, it carries traces I've only sensed from Celine and other dark practitioners. What if he's grooming them as weapons? Xavier's wheelchair hummed as he repositioned to face the team, his expression troubled but thoughtful. I've touched the minds of those children. Their emotional states have stabilized dramatically since arriving at that facility. Whatever this individual's nature, he appears to genuinely care about their welfare. Their thoughts show gratitude, hope, confidence, emotions I rarely see in newly manifested mutants. Appears Cyclops emphasized his tactical mind, always calculating worst-case scenarios. Professor, we can't risk another Magneto situation. Someone gathering powerful mutants under the pretense of protection, then using them for extremist goals once he's earned their loyalty. Which is why I intend to investigate directly, Xavier replied. Not with confrontation, but with understanding. We approach as concerned educators, not as adversaries. Rogue spoke from her position near the door, her Mississippi accent carrying concern that reflected broader student sentiment. Some of our students are talking about leaving for that facility. They say it sounds better than constant lectures about control and restraint. That his methods actually help them master their powers instead of just suppressing them. The statement hung in the air, its implications troubling to everyone present. Xavier had built his school to provide exactly what those students claimed to seek elsewhere. If his methods were being rejected in favor of an unknown alternative, the philosophical foundations of his life's work were being questioned. Then we must understand what he offers that we do not, Xavier said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of decades dedicated to mutant education. Tomorrow we investigate. But first, Scott Aurora, I want you to conduct reconnaissance. Physical observation, not engagement. Assess the facility's defenses. Observe his teaching methods if possible. I need to know what we're dealing with before I attempt mental contact. The next morning found Cyclops and Storm positioned 200 yards from the facility's perimeter concealed by tree cover as they conducted surveillance. Scott's visor scanned the structure, continuously tactical analysis overlaying his vision with threat assessments and entry points that updated in real time. The spatial distortions make conventional infiltration impossible, he reported through encrypted comlink to Xavier. Rooms exist in configurations that violate Euclidean geometry. If we needed to breach for an extraction, we'd need multiple teleporters coordinating simultaneously, and even then, I'm not confident we could navigate the interior. Aurora's eyes briefly whitened as she tested the facility's atmospheric patterns, her elemental powers probing the way weather systems interacted with the building. The meteorological patterns respond strangely near that structure. Wind currents bend at impossible angles following the spatial distortions, as though space itself curves around the building like gravity well. She lowered her hand, electrical discharge crackling between her fingers before dissipating. I don't like this, Scott. Too many unknowns. If this individual can manipulate reality on this scale just for architecture, what can he do in direct combat? Through the facility's windows, which themselves seem to exist in more places than geometry should allow, they could observe students training under the white-haired instructor's guidance. A teenage girl generated atomic decay effects with precision that should have taken years to develop, disintegrating a practice target at molecular level without any radiation spillover. Twin boys coordinated tactics through obvious telepathic link that showed none of the usual mental bleed or confusion that plagued young telepaths. They're progressing impossibly fast. Cyclops observed his visor recording everything for later analysis. That girl, I've seen her file from ONE's mutant watch list. 3 months ago, she couldn't control her power enough to touch another person without causing tissue necrosis. Now she's demonstrating molecular-level precision that takes most practitioners a decade to achieve. Is that concerning or impressive? Storm asked, genuine uncertainty in her voice. Both. Scott's jaw tightened, his tactical mind running through scenarios. If he can bring students to that level of control so quickly, he's either the greatest teacher in mutant history, or he's using methods we haven't identified yet. Possibly both. Neither option makes me comfortable with 17 vulnerable teenagers under his sole guidance. They observed for another hour, watching the white-haired instructor move between students with practiced efficiency. His teaching style emphasized direct action over theory, demonstrating techniques through application rather than explanation. When the toxic gas generator's powers activated accidentally, The instructor simply stood within the cloud, his defensive technique apparently rendering him immune, while he calmly waited for the boy to regain control. "He's teaching through confidence," Ororo observed, "showing them that their powers can't harm him, so they learn to trust themselves. It's effective but incredibly dangerous if his defensive technique ever fails." "Assuming it can fail," Scott countered. "We saw the footage from Times Square. The Avengers threw everything at him and didn't land a single hit. Thor's lightning, Captain Marvel's cosmic blasts, even Cap's shield, all stopped by that spatial manipulation technique." A student noticed their observation post. One of the telepathic twins, his developing mental awareness, detecting the focused attention being directed at the facility. He alerted his brother, and together they informed their teacher through gestures that didn't require shared language. The white-haired instructor looked directly toward the tree line where Cyclops and Storm were concealed. His eyes, impossibly blue even at this distance, tracked their position with precision that suggested enhanced perception far beyond normal human range. He didn't attack, didn't adopt defensive posture, didn't alert the other students to potential threat. He simply acknowledged their presence with a slight nod, then returned to teaching as though reconnaissance by the X-Men was expected and unremarkable. "He knows we're here," Storm said unnecessarily, "and doesn't consider us a threat," Scott replied, uncertain whether to be insulted or relieved. "Time to withdraw. We have enough intelligence for the professor's assessment." They departed before their presence could be detected by ONE. Satellites, or government surveillance, carrying observations that would inform Xavier's approach. The professor needed to understand this individual's methods, needed to determine whether he represented hope or threat to the broader mutant community that depended on Xavier's guidance. Back at the mansion, Scott delivered his report to the assembled X-Men with characteristic thoroughness. "The facility is practically impregnable to conventional assault. The instructor demonstrates complete confidence in his abilities, which his students respond to with absolute trust. Training methods are unconventional, but appear effective. No signs of coercion or manipulation. The students genuinely want to be there. Which makes the situation more complex, not less," Xavier observed. "If he's genuinely helping them, we have no cause to interfere. But if his methods or presence attract government attention, all 17 of those children will be caught in the crossfire. Then we need to establish communication," Jean Grey suggested. "Make our position clear. We're not enemies, but we're concerned about the implications of his presence. Maybe we can coordinate our efforts instead of working at cross purposes." Xavier nodded slowly, already preparing for the telepathic investigation he knew would be necessary. "Tomorrow, I'll attempt direct contact. Jean, Emma, you'll accompany me. We approach with caution, but also with openness. If this individual is truly committed to protecting mutant youth, then we share common cause despite our different methods." Storm's expression remained troubled as she looked at the holographic display still showing the Pennsylvania facility. "And if he refuses cooperation, if he sees any oversight as threat to his autonomy, then we monitor from a distance," Xavier decided. "And we prepare for the day when his presence inevitably draws hostile attention. Because eventually, ONE will discover that facility. And when they do, we'll need to decide whether we stand with him or against him." The X-Men dispersed, each processing the implications of a teacher whose methods challenged everything Xavier's philosophy represented. In the years since founding his school, the professor had encountered many who claimed to help mutants while pursuing hidden agendas. But this individual was different. His power was undeniable. His dedication to his students, apparently genuine, and his complete disregard for societal integration, potentially catastrophic. At the Pennsylvania facility, Gojō continued teaching his 17 students, aware that he'd been observed, but unconcerned about the implications. He'd dealt with oversight from Jujutsu High's political factions for years, had learned to navigate bureaucratic attention while maintaining his own methods. These X-Men, whoever they were, would either accept his approach or oppose it. Either way, his students would be protected and trained according to principles he knew worked. The sun set over rural Pennsylvania, casting long shadows across a facility where the impossible had become routine. And in Westchester, Xavier prepared for a telepathic investigation that would reveal just how fundamentally different this mysterious teacher truly was. The collision of philosophies was inevitable. The only question was whether it would end in understanding or conflict. Xavier arrived at dawn with Jean Grey and Emma Frost, the three most powerful telepaths in Earth 616, converging on the Pennsylvania facility with unified purpose. They came not with the full X-Men roster, but as telepathic specialists intending investigation rather than confrontation. The professor's wheelchair navigated the forest path with ease, advanced technology compensating for terrain that would challenge conventional mobility devices. They stopped at the tree line, 200 yards from the repurposed steel plant that satellite imagery couldn't properly map. Xavier's telepathic awareness extended outward, touching the minds of 17 young mutants sleeping in the facility. Their dreams showed none of the corruption or indoctrination he'd feared. Instead, he found adolescents processing normal anxieties mixed with genuine optimism about their developing control. Jean stood to his right, her red hair catching early sunlight as she focused her considerable telepathic power on the structure. Her phoenix-touched mind perceived layers most telepaths missed seeing through the spatial distortions that made the building's interior volume impossible. She frowned at what her senses detected. The architecture itself is wrong. Space folds in ways that shouldn't be stable without constant energy input. Whoever built this operates on principles I don't recognize, and I've seen Shi'ar dimensional engineering. Emma Frost Diamond Form, currently inactive to permit full telepathic function, extended her awareness with surgical precision. Where Xavier provided breadth and Jean provided depth. Emma specialized in cutting through deception and resistance. Her telepathy probed the facility's lone adult consciousness, searching for the truth beneath surface thoughts. What she encountered made her pause. The mind she touched wasn't broadcasting thoughts in any conventional sense. Instead, she perceived mathematical calculations running at speeds that suggested enhanced cognitive processing awareness, mapping the environment, through methods that bypassed normal human sensory input. And beneath it all, energy patterns her telepathy interpreted as hostile, despite detecting no actual aggressive intent. Xavier spoke quietly, his voice carrying concern. He's awake and aware of our presence. Inside the facility, Gojo's 6 eyes had detected the 3 powerful consciousnesses the moment they entered his perception range. He recognized the signature of mental investigation, had felt similar probes from Jujutsu High's political factions who'd attempted evaluating his threat level through curse technique analysis. These individuals were trying to read his mind, directly determine his intentions through telepathic intrusion. He considered his options. Allow the investigation potentially revealing information about his displaced origin that might cause additional complications. Resist through conscious effort, likely escalating the situation into confrontation. Or simply maintain his current mental state, continuing routine morning preparations while they observed. Xavier made the decision to proceed with deeper scan. The 3 telepaths linked their consciousnesses, combining their considerable power into unified probe that could penetrate most defensive barriers through sheer overwhelming force. Xavier provided the structure, Jean the raw strength, Emma the precision targeting. Together, they represented telepathic capability that had broken into minds protected by alien technology and mystical wards. They touched Gojo's consciousness simultaneously, their combined awareness pressing against his mental defenses. For a moment, contact held. Xavier perceived fragments memories of teaching, genuine concern for students, confusion about dimensional displacement. Jean felt the weight of responsibility, the burden of being strongest in a world that feared strength. Emma detected no deception, no hidden agenda, only straightforward determination to protect vulnerable youth. Then, Unlimited Void activated. The domain expansion didn't manifest in physical space. Gojo's technique responded to telepathic intrusion as it would to any hostile penetration of his personal boundaries. The domain formed in conceptual space in the realm where consciousness touched consciousness, creating a sphere of infinite information that flooded back through the telepathic connection. Xavier's vast mind, accustomed to processing the thoughts of thousands, simultaneously encountered input that transcended his operational capacity. Every sense, every concept, every possible permutation of experience existed in the same moment. The information didn't arrive sequentially. It arrived infinitely, each data point containing all other data points, recursive patterns folding back on themselves without resolution. The professor's consciousness buckled under the load. Cerebro enhanced his telepathy to planetary scale. But even that amplification couldn't process genuinely infinite input. He began pulling back immediately, recognizing the danger of complete mental overload that could leave him catatonic. Jean experienced the domain differently. Her Phoenix-touched awareness perceived the technique as it truly was not thought patterns, but a system of cognition that operated on principles outside conventional consciousness. The infinite information wasn't random. It was structured mathematical, a framework for processing reality that human minds couldn't naturally comprehend. She felt the Phoenix force stirring within her, attracted to the conceptual infinity, even as her human consciousness screamed for retreat. Emma endured approximately 3 seconds before her diamond form activated, instinctively cutting off her telepathic abilities as her body transformed into organic diamond. In diamond state, she was telepathically inert, completely severed from the mental plane. The transformation was involuntary survival response, her subconscious choosing temporary telepathic death over the alternative of drowning in infinite data. All 3 telepaths withdrew simultaneously, their connections severing as they pulled their awareness back to their own minds. Xavier sagged in his wheelchair, hands trembling as his brain struggled to process the aftershocks. Jean stumbled, her Phoenix power flaring visibly around her body as it worked to stabilize her consciousness. Emma stood rigid in diamond form, waiting for her mind to confirm the threat had passed before reverting to flesh. They stood in shocked silence for 30 seconds, each processing what they'd just encountered. Xavier recovered first, his centuries of mental discipline reasserting control despite the trauma. He'd faced many powerful telepaths, had survived psychic combat with entities like Shadow King and Cassandra Nova, but he'd never experienced anything like the domain expansion's infinite information flood. John's voice shook when she finally spoke. That wasn't telepathy. That wasn't even thought. It was like touching a black hole made of consciousness. Everything pulling inward toward infinite complexity. Emma reverted to human form slowly, her telepathy reaching out cautiously to confirm the connection had truly ended. He didn't attack us. That was reflexive defense. Automatic response to telepathic intrusion. Her usual confidence was shaken voice carrying uncharacteristic uncertainty. I've broken into Apocalypse's mind. I've survived mental combat with the Stepford Cuckoos at full synchronization. But that was defense on a level I didn't know was possible. Xavier nodded, his expression grave. Which means he operates on principles that treat telepathy as hostile action requiring immediate counter. We cannot safely investigate his mind. The risk of permanent damage is too severe for any of us to attempt again. Jean sensed the 17 students beginning to wake, their thoughts brightening as they transitioned from sleep to consciousness. None of them showed signs of mental manipulation or coercion. Their developing control over powers reflected genuine instruction rather than exploitation. Whatever else this mysterious teacher might be, he appeared to actually care about the children he'd gathered. Xavier made his conclusion. He's an anomaly. Not mutant, not magical practitioner, in the sense Strange would recognize, not cosmic entity. Something that exists outside our framework for understanding enhanced individuals. And he's genuinely helping those students develop control. Emma's assessment was more direct. He's also impossibly dangerous. That defensive technique alone makes him Omega-level threat. If he can do that reflexively to protect his mind, imagine what he could do intentionally as an attack. We cannot move against him without evidence of actual wrongdoing, Xavier stated firmly. Our telepathy cannot prove hostile intent, and destroying government property in defense of mutant youth is not itself villainous behavior. Many of us have done similar when circumstances demanded. Jane looked toward the facility, her phoenix perception still tracking the impossible spatial geometries. So, what do we do? We observe, Xavier replied. We maintain distance, monitor the situation, and intervene only if he demonstrates genuine threat to the students or broader community. And we inform the broader superhuman community that there is an individual of tremendous power whose capabilities we cannot fully assess. But Xavier didn't move to depart immediately. He sat in his wheelchair at the tree line, his telepathy operating at minimal output as he recovered his mind, still processing fragments of what he'd glimpsed before the domain expansion's defensive activation. The technique had forced retreat, yes, but not before he'd perceived impressions that lingered like after-images. A classroom. Students laughing. The white-haired teacher demonstrating technique with patient precision that spoke of years dedicated to education. Memories of loss. Bonds broken by circumstance. The weight of being strongest in a world that feared strength, carrying responsibility, that isolated even as it empowered. Xavier understood burden intimately. He'd carried similar weight throughout his life, navigating the impossible line between protecting vulnerable youth and preparing them for a hostile world. Despite the vast differences in their origins, despite operating under completely different frameworks of power, he recognized kinship. He made a decision, reaching out again, not to probe, but to communicate. Pure telepathic concepts, images stripped of language that transcended dimensional barriers. A picture of his school, his students, his lifelong mission to bridge the gap between human and mutant. An offering of understanding rather than investigation, colleague to colleague rather than threat assessment. Inside the facility, Gojō paused mid-instruction as foreign presence touched his awareness. Not hostile probe like before, but gentle offering. His 6 eyes perceived the telepathic communication as patterns of intent rather than words, structured differently than the invasive investigation that had triggered his defensive response. An image formed in his mind, a bald man in a wheelchair, surrounded by young people of various abilities. Teaching, protecting, guiding. The emotional weight behind the image carried decades of dedication to the same principles Gojō held. This wasn't attack or evaluation. This was recognition. He responded instinctively, projecting his own memories through cursed energy, shaped by will rather than telepathy. His students at Tokyo Jujutsu High, Yuji's determination, Megumi's quiet strength, Nobara's fierce independence. The satisfaction of watching vulnerable youth grow strong, confident, capable of protecting themselves and others. The burden of being teacher to those the world rejected or feared. Xavier received the response and understood completely. This individual, whatever else he might be, was teacher first and foremost. The protection of students superseded all other concerns, even self-preservation. They were the same in the way that mattered most, regardless of dimensional origin or power source. The professor projected one final concept: respect. Acknowledgment of shared purpose despite irreconcilable differences in method and origin. A promise that he would not interfere with the 17 teenagers under the white-haired man's care, provided they remained safe and willing. An offer of coordination rather than opposition, should circumstances require mutual action. Gojo's response came as simple agreement transmitted through the same conceptual framework. The students would be protected. They would grow strong. That was sufficient. If this telepath and his organization didn't threaten that mission, they could coexist without conflict. Xavier withdrew his telepathic presence, completely satisfied that he'd achieved understanding where investigation had failed. He activated his wheelchair's communication system, speaking to Cyclops through encrypted channel. Stand down from surveillance protocols. The individual in Pennsylvania is not threat we feared. He's colleague we didn't expect. Scott's response carried skepticism that crackled through the comlink. Professor, you're sure? After what just happened? I'm certain. He's Teacher Scott, like us. His methods differ dramatically from ours. His power operates on principles we don't understand, but his fundamental mission is identical. He protects and educates those whom society rejects. Xavier paused, considering his next words carefully. We'll monitor the situation, but from respectful distance. If the government moves against that facility, we'll need to consider our response carefully. Because in the end, that's what it meant to lead a school for the different and powerful. Sometimes you protected your students from the world. Sometimes you protected other teachers' students. And sometimes you recognized that your mission extended beyond your own walls, encompassing anyone who fought the same battle against fear and ignorance. John and Emma joined Xavier as he prepared to depart, both still processing the encounter that had pushed their telepathic abilities to breaking point. Emma spoke first, her voice carrying grudging respect. If he can teach students to that level of control in weeks, and defend his mind with techniques that overwhelm 3 Omega-level telepaths, he's possibly the most dangerous individual on this planet. And we're just going to leave him alone. We're going to trust him, Xavier corrected. Trust that his mission aligns with ours enough that conflict is unnecessary. And we're going to hope that the authorities see wisdom in the same approach. They departed through the forest, leaving the facility undisturbed. But Xavier knew the investigation's outcome would ripple through Earth 616's telepathic network within hours. Every powerful telepath would hear that Xavier Jean Grey and Emma Frost combined had attempted mental probe and been forced to retreat by automatic defensive response. The story would grow with each retelling details, embellishing until Gojō became something even more legendary than he already was. At Westchester, Xavier convened emergency session with the full X-Men roster. His report was succinct and troubling. An individual of unknown origin operating outside mutant classification, possessing defensive capabilities that made telepathic assessment impossible, training young mutants in facility, that defied conventional spatial geometry. No evidence of malicious intent, but capability suggesting Omega-level classification at minimum. The news reached Avengers Tower by evening, transmitted through the informal networks connecting superhuman organizations. Stark added the intelligence to his growing file on the white-haired anomaly. Reed Richards incorporated the telepathy failure into his theoretical models of the individual's power source. Strange received the information and felt his concerns deepen. In the Pennsylvania facility, Gojō continued his morning routine uninterrupted. The telepathic probe had activated domain expansion for perhaps a quarter second, barely long enough to register consciously. His students woke and assembled for training, unaware that their teacher had just survived investigation from 3 of Earth's most powerful telepaths, and that he'd achieved something more valuable than victory, mutual understanding with someone who shared his fundamental mission. The 17 teenagers ate breakfast together, their conversations mixing normal adolescent concerns with discussions of power control techniques. Meltdown demonstrated her improved precision, creating localized decay effect on a practice target without any spillover radiation. The telepathic twins showed off their ability to maintain separate consciousness while sharing tactical information in real time. Gojō watched them with satisfaction that transcended language barriers. These children reminded him of his students at Tokyo Jujutsu High. Powerful, uncertain, desperate for guidance from someone who understood their struggles. The fact that they existed in a different universe under different physical laws, trained against different threats, mattered less than the fundamental equation. They needed a teacher. He had the skills. Everything else would be addressed as it emerged. Across Earth 616, the designation became official through informal consensus among superhuman organizations. The white-haired individual with spatial manipulation abilities, teacher to mutant youth destroyer of Sentinel units, possessed of defensive techniques that defeated combined telepathic investigation from Omega-level practitioners. Classification unknown, Omega possibly higher. Approach with extreme caution. Do not attempt telepathic contact under any circumstances. Rumors spread through the mutant community with wildfire speed. A new protector had emerged. Someone more powerful than Xavier, more militant than Magneto, more mysterious than any enhanced individual in recent memory. Students at Xavier's school whispered about the Pennsylvania facility, about the teacher who didn't fear their powers or demand they suppress their abilities for society's comfort. 3 more left in the night, heading for the repurposed steel plant where something resembling hope had taken root. In the dark dimension, Dormammu observed these developments with patient satisfaction. The white-haired sorcerer was gathering connections, forming bonds, creating exactly the kind of emotional leverage that made excellent tools for manipulation. Soon, very soon, the barriers would weaken enough for proper invasion. And when that moment came, the entity would have all the motivation necessary to make his new acquisition cooperate. The game progressed toward its inevitable conclusion. The pieces moved into position, and at the center of the growing storm, Gojo Satoru taught 17 mutant teenagers how to control their powers, unaware that his simple act of protection had elevated him to legendary status among those who measured power in absolute terms. The sun rose over Pennsylvania, illuminating the facility where the impossible had become routine, where a teacher from another universe had found purpose in protecting students who needed exactly what he had to offer. Understanding had been achieved, if not through words, then through the universal language of shared mission. And sometimes that was enough. The dimensional barriers had been degrading for weeks, microscopic fractures spreading through the mystical architecture that separated Earth from adjacent realities. Strange monitored the deterioration from the Sanctum Sanctorum, watching crystalline instruments track stress patterns that worsened with each passing day. The cursed energy emission from Pennsylvania created resonance effects that propagated through dimensional boundaries, like sound waves through crystal finding natural frequencies and amplifying them beyond safe tolerance. The dark dimension felt the disruption most acutely. Dormammu's realm existed in constant state of barely controlled chaos, its structure maintained through the entity's overwhelming will, rather than any natural stability. The cursed energy's presence introduced foreign harmonics into that structure, notes that didn't belong in the dark dimension's terrible symphony. To Dormammu's perception, the cursed energy appeared as threads of crystallized suffering that bypassed the Vishanti's protective frameworks entirely. The entity had been patient, watching the white-haired sorcerer's activities through the weakening barriers, learning his patterns and capabilities. But patience had limits, and Dormammu's interest had evolved from curiosity to genuine desire. The unlimited void technique represented something the entity had never encountered: a method of overwhelming consciousness that operated independently of the dark dimension's own reality-warping properties. Such a tool could prove invaluable in expanding his dominion beyond its current boundaries. He began the invasion carefully, not with full manifestation that would alert every mystical defender on Earth, but with subtle incursion that could be mistaken for random dimensional instability. Dormammu sent avatars through the weakened barriers, fragments of his consciousness, wrapped in dark dimension matter and given semi-autonomous purpose. They emerged in locations where the dimensional fabric showed greatest stress, materialized in abandoned spaces, where their arrival wouldn't trigger immediate superhuman response. The cultists came next. Humans who'd pledged themselves to Dormammu's service in exchange for dark power, scattered across Earth in cells that activated on command. They converged on New York through mundane transportation, carrying ritual components and eldritch knowledge that would help stabilize the Avatar's manifestation. 12 cultists total coordinating through encrypted communications, preparing summoning circles in a warehouse district near the Brooklyn waterfront. Strange detected the ritual's activation through the sanctum's mystical alarms. The signature was unmistakable. Dark dimension energy coalescing on Earth, stabilized through human sacrifice and forbidden geometry. He opened a portal, immediately arriving at the warehouse site to find the ritual already in its final phase. 3 avatars stood fully manifested, their forms, constructed from shadow and flame, that flickered with malevolent intelligence. The Sorcerer Supreme began weaving counterspells golden light, forming complex patterns designed to banish extra-dimensional entities. But the avatars were more stable than they should be, anchored by cursed energy's disruption of normal magical rules. His banishment spells encountered resistance, their effectiveness reduced by the ambient interference. The avatars attacked in coordination, launching bolts of dark dimension energy that warped space as they traveled. Strange deflected them with shield constructs, but each impact stressed his defenses more than equivalent attacks should. The cursed energy's presence was amplifying the avatar's power, making them more dangerous than their size suggested. 10 miles away at the Pennsylvania facility, Gojo's 6 eyes detected the surge of hostile energy. The signature was similar to what he'd felt during the brief encounter with Dormammu's manifestation in Strange's chamber, but stronger now, more focused. 3 concentrated sources of malevolent power operating within the dimensional framework that his inherited sight struggled to parse. He made his decision in seconds. The 17 students were safe within the facility's spatial manipulations, protected by architecture that made conventional approach nearly impossible. He could investigate the disturbance and return before they even noticed his absence. Gojō activated his enhanced perception, fully mapping a path through space that would bring him to the conflict site with minimal travel time. The distance collapsed. He moved through successive teleportation jumps, each one covering miles as he bent cursed energy around his trajectory. The technique was exhausting, pushed his reserves harder than combat typically required, but speed mattered more than efficiency. He arrived at the warehouse district in time to see Strange locked in combat with 3 entities that his 6 eyes classified as similar to special grade curses, but constructed from fundamentally different energy. The robed sorcerer's defensive magic was holding but barely golden shields, showing cracks under repeated assault. Gojō didn't announce his presence. He simply acted blue, manifesting at a point behind the leftmost avatar. The attractive force caught the entity unprepared, yanking it backward with acceleration that tore its semi-stable form. Dark dimension matter wasn't meant to experience that kind of physical stress in Earth's reality. The avatar distorted its shape, elongating as Blue's gravitational well pulled it toward a singularity point. The entity screamed, the sound resonating across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Strange's attention snapped toward the newcomer, relief and concern mixing in his expression. The other 2 avatars turned to face this new threat, their tactical protocols recognizing Gojō as the primary danger. They attacked together, launching coordinated strikes of dark dimension energy from opposing angles. The attacks entered Infinity's sphere of influence and slowed predictably, their velocity decreasing as they approached until they hung motionless 6 feet from Gojo's position. He studied the frozen energy constructs with his 6 eyes, perceiving their structure and composition. Not cursed energy, but similar enough that his techniques could interact with them. Gojō canceled blue and activated red instead, directing the repulsive force at both remaining avatars simultaneously. The technique struck like hammers of compressed space, sending both entities flying backward into warehouse walls, with impacts that collapsed concrete and twisted steel supports. The structures the avatars had been anchoring themselves to for stability shattered, and without that foundation, their manifestation began degrading. Strange seized the opportunity, weaving banishment spells through the gaps in the avatar's defenses. Golden light wrapped around the destabilized entities, dragging them back toward the dimensional rifts they'd emerged from. 2 of the 3 avatars dissipated their dark dimension matter, returning to its home reality as the banishment completed. The 3rd avatar, the one Gojō had targeted with blue, initially proved more resilient. It had adapted to Earth's physics during the distortion, learned how to maintain cohesion despite the hostile environment. The entity pulled itself together, reforming from scattered fragments into a humanoid shape roughly 7 feet tall. It spoke with voice like breaking glass. "The Master perceives you, white-haired anomaly. Your essence calls to the dark dimension like a beacon. Surrender yourself, and he promises mercy for your adopted young." Gojo's expression remained neutral, but the threat to his students triggered the same spike in cursed energy that had occurred during the first Dormammu encounter. His power output increased involuntarily, Infinity's range expanding to 60 feet, the distortion in space becoming visible to normal perception as heat shimmer effects rippled outward. The avatar recoiled from the surge, its form flickering as the increased cursed energy emission destabilized its manifestation further. Strange recognized the danger signs immediately and redoubled his banishment efforts, channeling power directly from the eye of Agamotto. The combined assault of magical banishment and cursed energy disruption proved too much. The 3rd avatar collapsed its dark dimension matter, dissipating into vapor that sank through cracks in reality. Silence fell across the warehouse district, broken only by the creak of damaged structures settling. Strange lowered his hands, the banishment spells fading as he confirmed all 3 avatars had been expelled. He turned to face Gojō, translation magic activating automatically. "You shouldn't be here. Every time you use your power, you weaken the barriers further." Gojo's response came through the magical translation, his tone flat. They threatened my students. Strange understood the implication immediately. Dormammu had identified Gojo's vulnerability, the emotional connection that could be exploited for leverage. The entity would use the 17 mutant teenagers as tools to manipulate the white-haired sorcerer, forcing him to act in ways that would serve the Dark Dimension's invasion plans. Before Strange could respond, the space above them tore open. Not a portal, not a rift, but a wound in reality itself. Through the opening, they could see the Dark Dimension directly infinite darkness, illuminated by flames that burned without heat. Geometry that existed in more dimensions than human perception could process. And in the center of that terrible vista, a consciousness vast enough to span galaxies focused its full attention on Earth. Dormammu didn't attempt manifestation this time. He simply observed his awareness, pressing against reality like weight pressing against thin ice. When he spoke, the voice resonated through both dimensions, simultaneously bypassing the concept of sound to communicate directly with consciousness. I have decided, sorcerer of the empty void. Your unlimited void will become mine. Your students will serve as tools to ensure your cooperation. Strange cannot protect them all, cannot be everywhere simultaneously. Submit to me and I will make your transition painless. Resist and I will harvest their suffering before claiming you, regardless. Gojō stared up at the wound, in reality his 6 eyes perceiving the magnitude of the entity behind it. This wasn't a fight he could win through technique or power. Dormammu existed on a scale that made planetary concerns irrelevant, operated with resources that transcended any opposition Gojō could muster. But surrender wasn't in his vocabulary, had never been an option regardless of odds. His cursed energy output spiked again, and for a moment, the wound in reality flickered. Dormammu's attention sharpened, interested in this display of defiance from something so comparatively small. The entity could feel the unlimited void's conceptual structure through the connection, perceive its potential applications. Yes, this technique would serve his purposes admirably. Strange moved to reinforce the dimensional barriers, his hands weaving complex patterns that drew power from every mystical source available. The eye of Agamotto blazed brilliant green channeling energies that predated human civilization. The wound in reality began closing slowly, fighting against Dormammu's will to maintain it. The entity withdrew gradually, his parting words carrying absolute certainty. I will return with proper force, Strange. Your precious Earth lacks the strength to repel me once I commit fully. And when I claim what is mine, you will remember that cooperation would have spared much suffering. The wound sealed completely. Reality stabilized. The dimensional barriers reformed, though Strange could perceive the damage that remained. The cursed energy's presence had weakened them beyond his ability to fully repair. Dormammu could break through whenever he chose now. It was only a matter of time. Strange turned to Gojō, his expression grave. He knows about your students. He'll use them against you. Gojo's response was immediate. Then I protect them. You can't, Strange said quietly. Not from something that spans dimensions. Not from an entity that can manifest anywhere the barriers weaken. And your very presence weakens them constantly. The implications hung between them unspoken, but understood. Gojo's existence on Earth endangered everything, but leaving would abandon the 17 teenagers to an entity that had explicitly targeted them for leverage. There was no clean solution, no tactical option that preserved everyone's safety. In the dark dimension, Dormammu began preparations for full invasion. He'd been patient long enough, had gathered sufficient intelligence about the anomaly's capabilities and weaknesses. The white-haired sorcerer would submit or be broken. The unlimited void would become a tool of the dark dimension, and Earth 616 would fall. The game's final phase had begun. Dormammu's full attention focused on the Pennsylvania facility 3 days after the warehouse confrontation. The entity had been patient, observing the white-haired sorcerer's routines, calculating optimal moment for abduction. He chose the evening training session when Gojō stood in the central chamber, surrounded by 17 students practicing their developing control. The entity wanted witnesses, wanted the children to see their teacher taken, to understand their helplessness. The dark dimension tore through reality without warning. Space didn't crack or portal open. It simply inverted the laws governing Earth's physics, replaced instantly by the chaotic rules of Dormammu's realm. One moment Gojō stood on Pennsylvania soil. The next, he existed in infinite darkness, illuminated by flames that provided light without heat. Geometry folding through dimensions, his 6 eyes struggled to parse. Strange felt the dimensional violation from 300 miles away. His mystical awareness, detecting the massive energy expenditure required for that kind of forced translocation. Dormammu had pulled someone directly into the dark dimension, bypassing Earth's protective barriers entirely through sheer overwhelming power. The Sorcerer Supreme knew immediately who the target had been. At the facility, 17 mutant teenagers stood frozen in shock, staring at the space where their teacher had stood moments before. The spatial distortions he'd woven into the building's structure remained, but Gojō himself had vanished. Meltdown's hands sparked with uncontrolled atomic decay as panic threatened her concentration. The telepathic twins clutched each other, their mental connection flooding with terror. In the dark dimension, Gojō assessed his situation with the rapid calculation that came from years of facing impossible odds. Infinity activated, automatically creating sphere of normal space around his body that the dark dimension's chaotic physics couldn't immediately penetrate. His 6 eyes mapped the environment, finding nothing resembling conventional spatial coordinates. This realm existed outside the framework he understood, operated on principles that made cursed energy manipulation unreliable. Dormammu manifested before him not as limited avatar, but as his true form, a being of flame and shadow that filled perception without occupying specific space. The entity's consciousness pressed against Gojō's awareness, like atmosphere pressing against a submarine hull, vast and crushing. When Dormammu spoke, the words resonated through multiple dimensions simultaneously. "Welcome to my domain, sorcerer of the empty void. Here I am, absolute. Your techniques that bend space and divide infinity mean nothing, where I control the fundamental constants themselves." To demonstrate, Dormammu altered the space around Gojō's infinity. The protective sphere that subdivided distance into infinite series encountered environment where infinity itself was redefined. The technique continued functioning, but its effectiveness degraded as the dark dimension's rules rewrote the mathematics underlying Limitless. Gojō felt the degradation, immediately sensed his primary defense weakening in ways it never had before. He activated blue instinctively, manifesting attractive force in the direction he perceived as away from threat. The technique functioned, but the gravitational well it created behaved erratically in the dark dimension's physics. Matter and energy didn't respond predictably, flowing toward the focal point in patterns that violated conservation laws. Dormammu laughed, the sound like collapsing stars. "You begin to understand. Your power is considerable, perhaps even significant by the standards of your native reality. But here you are, merely interesting. A curiosity to be studied before absorption." The entity attacked, and the assault transcended anything Gojō had experienced. Dormammu didn't simply strike with energy or physical force. He rewrote the space Gojō occupied, transforming the region into a maze of contradictory physics, where distance became time and time became spatial dimension. Causality inverted. Effects preceded causes. Reality became suggestion rather than law. Gojo's 6 eyes processed the impossible environment through pure mathematical analysis, treating the chaos as data set requiring pattern recognition rather than comprehensible phenomena. He found threads of stability in the madness constants that remained even when everything else fluctuated. Cursed energy, for all its incompatibility with this dimension, provided anchor point that Dormammu's reality warping couldn't completely erase. He activated Unlimited Void. The domain expansion manifested differently in the dark dimension than it did on Earth. On Earth 16, the technique created sphere of infinite sensory information within normal space. Here in Realm, where space itself was malleable, Unlimited Void expanded without conventional boundaries. The domain flooded through the dark dimension like ink through water, carrying its infinite information payload into Dormammu's realm itself. The entity's consciousness, vast as it was encountered, the technique's effect directly. Infinite information, flooded perception, designed to process entire dimensions simultaneously. Every possible sensation, every conceivable thought, every permutation of experience existed in the same moment. The data didn't arrive sequentially. It arrived infinitely recursive patterns folding back on themselves without resolution. Dormammu's form flickered the flames, composing his body stuttering as his consciousness strained under the load. For a being accustomed to absolute control over his domain, the sensation of being overwhelmed was profoundly alien. He pushed back, channeling the full weight of the dark dimension's power against the technique. Time froze around Gojō, not through manipulation of velocity, but through literal suspension of temporal progression. Dormammu locked the moment into stasis, preventing the Unlimited Void from continuing its expansion. But the domain persisted in the frozen instant, its infinite information still flooding through pathways that transcended conventional causality. The clash between techniques created shockwave that rippled beyond the dark dimension's boundaries. In the spaces between realities, the weave that connected all of Marvel's mystical framework shuddered under stress it wasn't designed to withstand. Cursed energy and dark magic collided at fundamental level, neither capable of overwhelming the other, both incompatible enough that their interaction generated destructive interference. Strange felt the dimensional structure buckling perceived cracks, spreading through Earth 616's protective barriers. If the collision continued, the damage might become catastrophic. Entire regions of space could collapse into dimensional voids. The mystical architecture supporting Earth's reality could fragment beyond repair. In the dark dimension, Gojō pushed Unlimited Void to maximum output, channeling every reserve of cursed energy into sustaining the domain against Dormammu's temporal lockdown. His body began showing strained blood vessels in his eyes, rupturing from the effort of maintaining the 6 eyes at beyond peak functionality. Reverse curse technique activated, automatically healing the damage as fast as it occurred, but even that couldn't continue indefinitely. Dormammu realized the fundamental problem simultaneously. Neither could destroy the other. The entity's reality warping couldn't erase techniques rooted in completely foreign physics. Gojo's spatial manipulation couldn't overcome being whose existence spanned dimensions. They were deadlocked, 2 incompatible forces pressed against each other in stalemate that threatened to shatter reality itself. The entity made his calculation. Claiming the Unlimited Void wasn't worth destroying the dark dimension in the process. And continuing this battle would do exactly that, as cursed energy and dark magic tore gaps in dimensional fabric that even Dormammu couldn't immediately repair. He began withdrawing his assault, releasing the temporal lockdown gradually. Gojō canceled Unlimited Void as soon as he felt the pressure decrease his tactical mind, recognizing the same stalemate. He couldn't win this fight, but he demonstrated that he couldn't be easily taken, either that forcing his cooperation would cost more than the entity was willing to pay. Dormammu's voice carried different tone now, anger mixed with grudging respect. You are more troublesome than anticipated white-haired anomaly. Very well. I withdraw from direct confrontation. But understand this, your presence in Earth 616 continues weakening dimensional barriers. Eventually the structure will collapse, whether I act or not. When that occurs, I will claim everything, including your precious students. The entity paused his attention, focusing on the damage their battle had caused. Cracks in dimensional fabric that would take decades to heal stress patterns that propagated through adjacent realities. The mathematical certainty was undeniable. Strange will tell you the truth if you ask. Your existence in his reality is terminal diagnosis. Every day you remain, you accelerate the collapse. Earth 6116 will fall, and you will be the catalyst. The only question is whether you submit to me before that occurs, or whether you watch your adopted world burn first. Dormammu released Gojō from the dark dimension translocation, occurring as abruptly as the initial abduction. One moment surrounded by infinite darkness, the next standing in the Pennsylvania facility's central chamber. 17 teenagers rushed toward him, their relief visible and overwhelming. He'd been gone less than 5 minutes by Earth's time reference, though the subjective experience had felt like hours. Gojō stood among his students, accepting their concern with characteristic stoicism, while his mind processed Dormammu's final statement. Terminal diagnosis. Dimensional collapse. His presence alone destroying the world he'd tried to protect by helping these children. Strange arrived minutes later, portal opening directly into the facility's central chamber. The sorcerer, Supreme's expression was grave as he surveyed the aftermath, his mystical senses perceiving the dimensional stress that Gojō carried with him from the dark dimension confrontation. Their eyes met across the room, and Gojō saw confirmation in Strange's face. Dormammu hadn't been lying. The entity's threat was truth presented as manipulation. Earth 616 couldn't support cursed energy's presence indefinitely. The framework was breaking, and there was no solution that allowed Gojō to remain while preventing catastrophe. The 17 students clustered around their teacher, unaware that his protection had become their greatest danger, that every day he trained them brought Earth closer to dimensional collapse. Marcus asked if he was injured, voice full of concern. Lynn offered water. Sarah kept one hand on his arm as though physical contact could anchor him after his disappearance. Gojō looked at them. These children who'd placed absolute trust in his ability to keep them safe and felt the weight of impossible choice settling onto his shoulders. Stay and watch Earth fall. Leave and abandon them to a world that hunted them. Submit to Dormammu and become tool of dimensional conquest. Strange's voice was quiet when he finally spoke translation magic, carrying the words directly to Gojo's comprehension. We need to talk. Privately. Now. The students reluctantly backed away, sensing the gravity of the conversation about to occur. Gojō followed Strange through a portal to the Sanctum Sanctorum's meditation chamber, leaving his 17 teenagers in the facility he'd built, surrounded by protections that would mean nothing if dimensional barriers collapsed completely. In the chamber, Strange laid out the mathematical certainty with clinical precision. Reed Richards' analysis confirmed by mystical observation, confirmed by dimensional stress measurements. Earth 16 had perhaps 3 weeks before the accumulated damage became irreversible, After that, reality would begin fragmenting whether Dormammu acted or not. "You have to leave," Strange said flatly. "Not just Pennsylvania, not just Earth. You need to depart this dimension entirely, find somewhere in the void between realities where your presence won't destroy inhabited worlds." Gojo's response was immediate. "My students will die regardless if you stay," Strange replied. "Along with everyone else on Earth. You're not protecting them anymore. You're killing them slowly." The words hit like physical blows. Gojō had spent his entire adult life as teacher, as protector, as the strongest barrier between vulnerable youth and hostile forces. And now his very existence was the hostile force. The strongest had become the greatest threat. Strange continued his tone, carrying genuine sympathy beneath the clinical assessment. "I'll protect them after you're gone. Xavier will provide shelter. The superhuman community will ensure they're not out and not hunted. But you have to go, and you have to go soon." Gojō stood in the Sanctum Sanctorum's meditation chamber, 300 miles from 17 students who thought he was their salvation, and confronted the truth that Dormammu had delivered, wrapped in threats. He was killing them. Slowly, inevitably, by simply existing in their proximity. The choice wasn't between hard options anymore. There was only one option, and everything else was just delay before accepting it. In the dark dimension, Dormammu watched Earth 616's dimensional barriers continuing their degradation and smiled his terrible smile. Whether the white-haired sorcerer submitted or fled, the outcome served the entity's purposes. The barriers would fall. The invasion would succeed. It was only a matter of time. The Endgame had arrived. Reed Richards presented his findings to the assembled superhuman leadership in the Baxter Building's conference chamber, 72 hours after Gojo's confrontation with Dormammu. Holographic displays filled the room with data visualization that painted an undeniable picture of dimensional collapse. Tony Stark stood near the projections, his analytical mind processing the information with growing alarm. Strange hovered at the room's perimeter, already knowing the conclusions, but needing the scientific community to reach them independently. The gathered representatives included Xavier, via telepresence Carol Danvers, representing the Avengers, T'Challa observing for Wakanda, and Namor, speaking for Atlantis. Thor had been summoned from Asgard, his divine perspective on dimensional stability potentially valuable. Each of them studied Reed's data with varying degrees of comprehension, but all understood the fundamental message: Earth 616 was dying. Reed's presentation moved through categories with clinical precision. First, temporal drift measurements, showing that time itself flowed inconsistently within 5 miles of the Pennsylvania facility. Clocks ran fast or slow, unpredictably. Quantum decay rates fluctuated beyond standard deviations. The cursed energy emission was interfering with causality at microscopic scales, creating pockets where past and future bled together. Second, magical destabilization analysis compiled from Strange's mystical observations and data from Kamartaj's monitoring stations worldwide. The weave of magic that connected all practitioners showed stress fractures radiating from 3 epicenters: Times Square, where Gojō first arrived, the Brooklyn warehouse, where he'd fought avatars, and the Pennsylvania facility, where he currently resided. Each location marked a point where cursed energy had interacted intensely with Earth's mystical infrastructure. Third, nexus point oscillation that Reed struggled to explain in purely scientific terms. Earth existed as a nexus of multiple dimensional pathways, a hub where realities intersected through carefully maintained balance. The cursed energy's presence created resonance effects that propagated through those pathways, destabilizing connections to adjacent dimensions. The mirror dimension showed increasing instability. The negative zone's barriers weakened measurably. Even Asgard's Bifrost experienced interference when attempting transport near the affected regions. Fourth, telepathic feedback that Xavier confirmed through direct observation. Every telepath on Earth reported increasing difficulty maintaining mental connections within expanding radius of the Pennsylvania facility. The cursed energy created static in the psychic plane noise that made communication unreliable and threatened to sever the worldwide telepathic network that mutants relied upon for coordination and survival. Reed's final projection showed timeline extrapolation based on current degradation rates. 3 weeks until temporal drift became severe enough to cause observable anachronisms, objects aging or de-aging visibly as time lost coherence. 4 weeks until magical infrastructure collapse rendered Earth vulnerable to dimensional invasion from every hostile entity that had been kept at bay. 5 weeks until Nexus Point failure caused Earth 616 to fragment into isolated reality pockets that couldn't maintain stable existence. The room remained silent after Reed concluded each representative processing implications that transcended normal threat assessment protocols. Tony spoke first, his voice stripped of its usual humor, carrying the weight of an engineer who'd just been told the foundation was crumbling beneath everything he'd built. So we're looking at extinction-level threat from someone who isn't actively hostile. He's just incompatible with reality itself. Like introducing antimatter into normal matter, they can't coexist without mutual annihilation. Reed nodded gravely. Cursed energy operates on principles that don't exist in our universal framework. It's not magic or mutation or cosmic power. It's something from outside the local dimensional cluster entirely. And its presence here creates cascade failure at every level of reality structure. Thor's deep voice rumbled through the chamber, carrying the weight of Asgardian wisdom accumulated over millennia. The All-Father has sensed this disturbance from Asgard's throne. Our seers report visions of Midgard fracturing its threads in the world tree, beginning to fray and separate. If this continues unchecked, Earth may cease to exist across all 9 realms, simultaneously erased not just from this dimension, but from the entire cosmic structure. Xavier's telepathic projection leaned forward. His expression troubled as he wrestled with implications that challenged his fundamental principles. The individual in question has demonstrated nothing but protective instincts toward vulnerable youth. He's not villain requiring defeat or containment. He is casualty of dimensional accident who has become threat through no fault of his own, no choice. He made no action. He took beyond simply existing. Which makes this worse, Carol said quietly, her military background providing context for impossible tactical situations. If he were villain, the solution would be straightforward. Containment or neutralization through whatever force necessary. But he's hero trapped in situation where his existence is the problem. How do we resolve this without becoming monsters ourselves? How do we ask someone to die, possibly die to save a world that isn't even his own? Tony paced near the holographic displays, his restless energy filling the space as his mind ran through every alternative scenario his genius could conceive. I've spent years building fail-safes against threats exactly like this. Ultron protocols, Thanos contingencies, interdimensional invasion response systems. But this guy isn't threat. We can armor against or out-engineer. He's fundamental incompatibility with existence itself. His voice carried frustration that bordered on despair. I've run every simulation Jarvis can process. Any solution that keeps him here results in planetary extinction within 8 weeks. Any solution that moves him to adjacent dimension just delays the collapse. We need him gone from our entire dimensional cluster. Carol Danvers had been uncharacteristically quiet throughout the presentation. Her arms crossed as she processed information through the lens of someone who'd fought across galaxies and witnessed civilizations fall. Now she spoke, her voice measured, but carrying emotional weight. I fought in the Kree-Skrull War. Seen entire species driven to extinction, watched planets collapse under their own gravity, stood witness to empires that thought themselves invincible, reduced to cosmic dust. But this is different. We're condemning someone who's been nothing but heroic, who's protected those society rejected, who's taught students everyone else gave up onto exile and dimensional void, with significant probability of death, because his existence is incompatible with ours. The alternative is condemning 7 billion people to certain death. Namor stated flatly, his voice carrying the cold logic of a ruler who'd made harsh decisions for his people's survival. The surface world's survival supersedes individual preferences, regardless of that individual's power or intentions. If one must die so billions can live, the mathematics is simple. Thor's expression showed disagreement, his warrior's code rejecting such utilitarian calculations. The white-haired warrior has fought with honor of the greatest Asgardian heroes. He protected those whom society had abandoned, stood against forces that would harm the innocent, demonstrated courage that transcends dimensional boundaries. Asgard does not exile heroes for circumstances beyond their control. There must be another way. Then Asgard can offer him sanctuary. Namor shot back his patience with sentimentality wearing thin. Remove him from Earth to your golden realm. Problem solved and you satisfy your honor code. The dimensional destabilization would continue. Reed interjected his scientific precision, cutting through the ethical debate. Earth 616 and Asgard are too closely connected through the world tree, through the dimensional pathways that link the 9 realms. His presence anywhere in our local dimensional cluster creates the same cascade failure, just shifted to different location. The collapse might start in Asgard instead of Earth, but it would spread to encompass everything, regardless. T'Challa, who had observed quietly throughout the debate while absorbing information through Wakandan analytical frameworks, finally spoke with the measured authority of someone who ruled a nation by balancing tradition and pragmatism. We are asking someone to potentially die to save a world that is not his own. To abandon students he's sworn to protect, to sacrifice himself for people he's never met and circumstances he didn't create. Whatever else we might debate about methods or solutions, we must acknowledge the magnitude of that sacrifice and ensure it's honored appropriately. The chamber fell silent as the weight of T'Challa's words settled over Earth's defenders. They were asking for sacrifice that transcended conventional heroism, demanding that someone erase themselves from existence to preserve a reality they had no connection to, beyond brief weeks of accidental residency. Xavier's projection showed profound sadness as he contemplated the situation through the lens of someone who dedicated his life to protecting those whom society rejected. I've communicated with this individual, achieved understanding despite the barriers between us, despite operating under completely different frameworks of power and origin. He's teacher like myself. His students have grown more in weeks under his guidance than some of mine do in years. Asking him to abandon them goes against everything he represents, violates the core of who he is as educator and protector. Which is why we ensure they're protected after he leaves. Strange said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had made similar impossible choices throughout his career as Sorcerer Supreme. Xavier, you'll offer sanctuary to those who wish it. Other facilities will open their doors. The superhuman community will collectively ensure they're not hunted, not abandoned, not left vulnerable to government persecution or exploitation. Cyclops participating via video link from Westchester raised the tactical concern that military training demanded he address. And what guarantee do we have that he'll cooperate with Exile if he refuses, if he decides protecting his students requires remaining despite the consequences? Do we force the issue? Start a war that accelerates the very collapse we're trying to prevent? Because based on the Times Square footage and Xavier's telepathic assessment, forcing compliance isn't a viable option. Carol's expression was troubled as she considered the question, her warrior's instinct recognizing the dilemma. I'll talk to him, warrior to warrior. If anyone can explain the honor in strategic retreat, the courage required to sacrifice yourself for those you'll never meet, it's someone who's made similar choices, who's walked away from fights that mattered because the cost of staying was too high. I'll approach him first. Strange countered his relationship with Gojō carrying weight that military appeals might lack. We've established communication protocols through translation magic. He trusts me as much as he trusts anyone in this dimension. If the request comes from me with explanation of the full situation, he's more likely to understand the necessity. T'Challa's voice carried the wisdom of a leader who understood that how you asked mattered as much as what you asked. We are requesting, not demanding. We must make that distinction clear. He has agency in this decision, even if the consequences of refusal are catastrophic. Approaching as supplicants rather than authorities may make difference between cooperation and conflict. The chamber's atmosphere shifted as the assembled heroes recognized the truth in T'Challa's observation. They weren't in position to demand anything from someone whose power exceeded their ability to contain or compel. They could only ask, explain, and hope that shared values would lead to willing sacrifice. Tony broke the silence that had fallen his voice, uncharacteristically soft, carrying vulnerability, the genius rarely displayed. Reed, if we do this, when we do this, I want every bit of data we've gathered preserved in most secure archive we can create. His techniques, his energy signature, dimensional transit readings, everything. If there's even a chance we can use that information to help him later, or to prevent this kind of accident from happening again, or to find a way to contact him if he survives. Already compiled and secured, Reed assured him, recognizing the emotional need behind the request. Complete records will be archived across multiple secure locations and made accessible to authorized researchers. If he survives the transit, if we ever find a way to establish contact with his home dimension or any other reality where he might exist, we'll have the foundation to build on. His sacrifice won't be forgotten, and the knowledge won't be lost. Xavier's projection showed an expression of profound sadness, mixed with resignation as he processed the inevitable conclusion they were approaching. Then we agree. We ask him to leave, explain the full situation with complete honesty, and we pray that his sacrifice isn't in vain. And we ensure that the 17 students he protected receive the care and education he would have wanted for them. Strange prepared to open a portal to the Pennsylvania facility, steeling himself for conversation that would require him to ask someone who'd become something like a colleague to walk into potential oblivion for strangers. Before departing, he turned to address the assembled defenders one final time. I'll present the situation honestly. Show him Reed's data, explain the timeline, make clear that we're requesting rather than demanding. But ultimately, the choice is his. If he refuses, we'll need to reconvene and discuss alternatives that frankly don't exist in any meaningful sense. The Sorcerer Supreme opened his portal and stepped through, leaving Earth's defenders to contemplate the weight of what they'd just agreed to ask. In the silence that followed his departure, each representative processed their role in condemning a hero to exile, in asking for sacrifice that transcended any reasonable expectation. Carol spoke quietly, voicing the thought that weighed on all of them. If he agrees to this, if he walks into that dimensional void, knowing he might not survive, what does that make us? The people who asked him to die for our convenience? It makes us survivors, Namor stated bluntly. And survival sometimes requires harsh choices. It makes us people who owe him debt we can never repay. Xavier corrected his telepathic presence, carrying the full weight of moral responsibility he felt. And it makes us responsible for ensuring his sacrifice means something for protecting what he protected and honoring what he stood for. Thor nodded gravely, his hand resting on Mjolnir as he made a personal vow. His name will be recorded in Asgard's halls of heroes. Future generations will know that a teacher from beyond the 9 realms gave his life to save world, not his own. That is honor that transcends dimensional boundaries. At the Pennsylvania facility, Gojō sat with his 17 students, teaching them the final refinements of their power control. Unaware that Earth's defenders had just made decision that would end his time in this dimension. Unaware that soon, very soon, he would face choice that would define whether he was merely strong or truly worthy of the legend that had grown around him. The council had made its decision. Now came the moment when the strongest would prove whether strength included wisdom, to know when sacrifice served better than persistence. The endgame had begun. 3 days passed in structured routine that carried weight of finality. Gojō taught as he always had, guiding his 17 students through refinements of control they'd spend years perfecting. But every lesson now carried subtext. They gradually recognized these were principles they'd need to carry forward, a lone wisdom that had to sustain them through his absence. On the final morning, he gathered them in the central training chamber one last time. They assembled with unusual solemnity, sensing something significant approaching, though none had been told explicitly what would occur. Gojō stood before them, white hair catching the early light, his blue eyes tracking each face with enhanced perception that memorized every detail. He spoke in Japanese, knowing they couldn't understand his words, but trusting his intent would translate through tone and presence. He told them that strength wasn't measured by power alone, that true mastery came from understanding when to act and when to restrain. He explained that the greatest teachers protected students not by shielding them from every hardship, but by ensuring they developed capability to protect themselves. Meltdown understood first, her eyes widening as comprehension settled. The twins followed seconds later, their telepathic connection processing implications faster than individual thought. One by one, the 17 teenagers realized what their teacher was telling them: he was leaving and he wouldn't be returning. Marcus stepped forward, his voice shaking with emotion he couldn't quite control. "You're abandoning us." Gojō shook his head slowly, the gesture transcending language. Not abandonment. Protection through absence. The hardest lesson a teacher could impart, sometimes caring, meant letting go. He spent the remaining hours working individually with each student, ensuring they understood the specific principles governing their abilities. Final adjustments to technique. Last reminders about mental state and emotional control. Everything they'd need to continue developing without his guidance. When the sun reached its zenith, marking the appointed time for transit ritual, all 17 understood what was about to occur. They followed him outside, forming silent procession to the clearing where Strange had established the ritual site. But they weren't alone. Earth's defenders had come to witness the sacrifice they'd asked for, representatives from each faction who felt the weight of what was about to occur. Tony Stark landed his armor 50 yards from the ritual site, repulsors dimming, as he touched down with characteristic precision. His faceplate retracted immediately, revealing features marked by exhaustion that even his arc reactor's limitless energy couldn't alleviate. He approached Gojō with uncharacteristic hesitation, his usual confidence tempered by awareness of what he was witnessing. "I've been building things my entire life," Tony said, his voice stripped of its usual bravado. "Suits that let me fly reactors that power cities' solutions to problems everyone else said were impossible. But I can't build a way out of this one." He paused, searching for words that felt adequate to the moment. "Your students are lucky to have had you even for the short time you were here. That kind of teaching, that level of genuine care, it's rarer than any technology I've ever created." Gojō nodded his 6 eyes, perceiving the sincerity beneath Tony's words, despite the language barrier. The engineer's mind recognized kinship in someone who manipulated reality through applied technique rather than inherited power, who solved problems through skill and understanding rather than brute force. Carol Danvers descended next, her photon energy dimmed to barely visible glow that cast subtle illumination across her features. She studied Gojō with the assessing gaze of someone who'd fought across galaxies, who'd witnessed every variety of courage the universe had to offer. When she spoke, her voice carried the respect of one warrior acknowledging another. "I've served with the best warriors in the Kree Empire, fought alongside the Avengers and the Guardians of the Galaxy. Seen heroes make impossible choices in the name of protecting others. What you're doing, walking into potential oblivion to save people you barely know. Abandoning students you've sworn to protect because your presence endangers them. That's the kind of courage that transcends species and dimension." She touched her fist to her chest, in military salute, the gesture universal in its meaning. "Honor to you, warrior. May the stars guide you home." Thor approached with Mjolnir held loosely at his side, storm clouds gathering overhead. Not from aggression, but from the god of thunder's emotional state, affecting the weather itself. His divine awareness sensed the weight of what was occurring, the sacrifice being made by someone who had no obligation to this realm. In Asgard, we commemorate great sacrifices in saga and song, preserving them for future generations so that heroes are never forgotten. Thor said, his voice carrying the formality of ancient oath-taking. "Your name will be recorded in our halls, white-haired teacher. The Skalds will sing of the one who came from beyond the 9 realms and gave his existence to save a world not his own. That is honor that transcends all dimensional boundaries." Cyclops and Storm represented the X-Men standing together as they observed the facility's structure one final time. Scott's visor tracked Gojo's movements with tactical precision. Even now, the habitual assessment of a soldier who could never fully stop analyzing threats. But his voice carried respect when he finally spoke. "We opposed your methods initially," Cyclops stated, his tone formal, but genuine. "Thought you were too reckless with students who needed careful guidance and measured development. We were wrong about one thing that matters more than technique. You genuinely cared about them. That kind of dedication to protecting the vulnerable, that willingness to put their welfare above everything else, including your own survival. That's what separates teachers from instructors." Storm's white hair lifted in supernatural breeze as her elemental powers responded to the emotional significance of the moment. The winds carry intentions across great distances, speaking truths that words often cannot express. They tell me you are protector, guardian, teacher, in the truest sense. May they carry you safely to whatever destination awaits, and may the sky always offer you shelter. Xavier's presence made itself known telepathically, his consciousness touching the minds of those assembled with gentle reassurance that transcended verbal communication. His attention focused on Gojō, projecting images rather than words. A school continuing its mission. After its founder departed, students honoring their teacher's legacy through their growth and achievements, protection offered to all 17 teenagers who would soon be without their guardian. A promise that the work Gojō had begun would not be abandoned, that the children he'd protected would find sanctuary with those who understood what he'd been trying to accomplish. Gojō received each interaction with the dignity they offered his 6 eyes, perceiving the genuine respect behind their words, even when language barriers prevented full comprehension. These individuals hadn't asked for him to be their problem, hadn't chosen to sacrifice him to save their world. But they acknowledged the cost, stood witness to the price, and offered what honor they could to someone who'd earned it through actions rather than words. Reed Richards approached last, his scientific mind momentarily set aside in favor of human compassion that his brilliant intellect sometimes overshadowed. Your energy operates on principles I don't fully understand physics, that exist outside our universal framework. But the little I've learned in these few weeks has expanded my theoretical understanding more than a decade of conventional research. He held up a small data drive. Everything we've recorded about your abilities, your energy signature, the dimensional mechanics of your presence here, it's all preserved. If you survive this transit, if there's ever a way to establish contact again, we'll have the foundation to build on. Your sacrifice won't be forgotten, and the knowledge you've given us won't be lost. The 17 students watched from the facility's entrance as their teachers stood surrounded by Earth's greatest defenders, offering respects they barely understood. Meltdown's hands, sparked with controlled atomic decay, the precision a testament to lessons learned in such short time. The telepathic twins shared thoughts about gratitude and lost their mental connection stable enough to process overwhelming emotions without feedback loop. Marcus stood at the front, his electrical abilities creating corona discharge that reflected his emotional state. Tears running down his face as he tried to maintain the composure their teacher had instilled. They wanted to speak, to offer final words that would somehow express what their teacher had meant to them. He'd taken terrified refugees and transformed them into confident practitioners. He'd shown them that power wasn't curse, but responsibility, that their abilities could be mastered rather than feared. He'd given them the one thing society had denied hope, that they could be more than their mutations, more than the fear others projected onto them. Strange stood at the ritual circle's center, the eye of Agamotto already glowing with preliminary power as he prepared the complex mystical architecture that would open a gateway between dimensions. Xavier's cerebral enhancer hummed at full capacity nearby, ready to provide telepathic stabilization during the transit. Thor positioned himself at one cardinal point, Mjolnir raised as storm clouds overhead rotated around a central axis. Carol took position at another point, her photon energy building to maximum output for the containment field that would prevent cursed energy spillover. The Sorcerer Supreme met Gojo's eyes across the distance, and between them passed understanding that needed no translation. 2 practitioners of impossible arts, both accustomed to standing alone against forces others couldn't comprehend, both carrying burdens that isolated even as they empowered. Strange had asked him to make this sacrifice, had explained the necessity with brutal honesty. Now came the moment when words ended and action defined everything. It's time. Strange said simply, his voice carrying across the clearing with finality. Gojō walked forward, leaving Earth's defenders behind as he approached the circle that would send him into the void between dimensions. Their words had mattered. Their presence had mattered. The acknowledgment that his sacrifice carried meaning, that he wasn't simply being discarded as problem requiring removal, that mattered more than they might realize. But now came the moment of execution, when all the philosophy and sentiment reduced to single question, would he do what needed to be done? He stepped into the circle's center, and Strange began the incantation. Golden light erupted from symbols carved into the earth, forming 3-dimensional geometric patterns. that hurt to observe directly, as they existed partially in dimensions human perception couldn't fully process. The eye of Agamotto pulsed in rhythm with Strange's words, each pulse tearing small openings in reality that immediately tried to seal themselves against the violation. Xavier's telepathic presence wrapped around Gojo's mind, not intruding but supporting, providing anchor point that would prevent complete dissolution of consciousness during the transit. The professor's mental touch carried wordless reassurance and profound respect for the sacrifice being made. Thor's lightning struck the ritual circle not as attack, but as channeled divine power that reinforced the dimensional boundaries, while Strange worked. The storm overhead intensified its rotational energy, extending beyond physical space into adjacent dimensions, where weather as humans understood it didn't exist. Carol's photon energy created containment field around the entire operation, preventing cursed energy spillover from destabilizing the surrounding region as the dimensional rift opened. Her cosmic awareness tracked every fluctuation, ready to compensate if the ritual began failing. The rift began forming at the circle's center, a tear in reality that showed not darkness but impossible distance, the void between universes where physics itself became negotiable, where existence was choice rather than certainty. Strange's hands moved through patterns of increasing complexity as he widened the gateway, fighting against dimensional tension that resisted connecting fundamentally incompatible realities. Gojō activated Unlimited Void at maximum capacity, not as weapon, but as stabilizing force. The domain expansion manifested differently this time, spreading through the dimensional rift like roots seeking purchase in alien soil. His cursed energy poured through the gateway, providing structure that Strange's magic could build upon, creating hybrid framework that neither technique could achieve alone. The effort exceeded anything Gojō had attempted before, pushing his capabilities beyond theoretical limits he'd never tested. His body became conduit for power that wanted to tear him apart, cursed energy flowing through channels never meant to sustain that kind of output. He felt himself stretching across dimensions, consciousness extending through layers of reality that human awareness couldn't normally perceive. The six eyes showed him everything, simultaneously. Earth 616 behind him, with its defenders watching the void ahead, with its infinite possibilities and countless adjacent realities, pressing against the narrow pathway Strange had opened. Blood vessels in his eyes ruptured from the strain. Reverse cursed technique activating automatically to heal damage as fast as it occurred. But even that had limits, regeneration struggling to keep pace with destruction as his body paid the price of bridging incompatible dimensions. Xavier's telepathic support intensified, holding Gojo's sense of self together when the dimensional stress threatened fragmentation. Thor's lightning provided grounding literal anchor to physical reality that prevented complete dissolution. Carol's containment field compressed the cursed energy emission, focusing it into the rift rather than letting it bleed into Earth 616's atmosphere. Strange saw the pathway stabilizing, saw the cursed energy and mystical framework achieving temporary equilibrium that wouldn't last more than seconds. He called out through translation magic, his voice barely audible over the dimensional roar. "Now walk forward. The gateway won't hold long." Gojō took his first step toward the rift, his body moving through space that tried to exist in multiple locations simultaneously. Each step required conscious effort to maintain cohesion, to keep his physical form from dispersing across dimensional boundaries like smoke and wind. He didn't look back at his students, couldn't afford the distraction when all his concentration focused on traversing the impossible distance between universes. The 17 teenagers watched their teacher walk into light that hurt to perceive, saw his form becoming translucent as he passed through layers of reality. Their eyes weren't designed to process. Meltdown gripped Marcus's hand so tightly, her atomic decay ability activated momentarily, requiring conscious suppression as her control wavered under emotional strain. The telepathic twins shared overwhelming grief that amplified between them before they managed to dampen the feedback loop their teacher had taught them to control. Gojō reached the rift's threshold, stood at the boundary between Earth 616 and the void beyond. For one eternal moment, he existed in both locations. Simultaneously, his consciousness stretched across dimensional divide that should have annihilated anything attempting the crossing. His 6 eyes perceived his 17 students one final time, memorizing faces he would carry into whatever existence awaited. Then he stepped through completely, and the stabilizing presence of cursed energy began withdrawing from Earth 616's reality. Strange released the ritual, letting the dimensional rift collapse now that its purpose was served. The golden light retracted, symbols fading from the ground, Eye of Agamotto dimming to inactive state. Thor's storm dissipated into clear sky. Carol's containment field dissolved into nothing. The clearing fell silent, except for the sound of 17 teenagers processing loss. They couldn't fully articulate grief that transcended their ability to express. Meltdown's control shattered completely, her atomic decay ability radiating outward in uncontrolled burst before she managed to suppress it through sheer force of will their teacher had instilled. The telepathic twins collapsed to their knees, their mental connection flooding with shared pain. Marcus's electrical discharge intensified until he resembled living lightning bolt corona visible in broad daylight. Strange stared at the empty space where the gateway had existed, his mystical senses confirming successful transit while providing no information about Gojo's survival. The cursed energy signature that had permeated Earth 616 for weeks faded rapidly, dimensional stress patterns beginning their slow healing. Temporal drift was already correcting. The weave of magic showed signs of stabilization. Reed's instruments confirmed what Strange sensed: zero cursed energy remaining, dimensional barriers, strengthening all stress indicators, trending toward normal parameters. Earth 616 would survive, but none of them could confirm whether the individual who'd made that survival possible had reached his home universe or dissolved into the void between realities. Carol descended to ground level, her cosmic awareness scanning the dimensional boundaries for any trace of the person who'd just sacrificed himself. She found nothing. No energy signature, no consciousness echo, no indication whether Gojo Satoru existed anywhere in the multiverse anymore. "Did he make it?" she asked quietly, voicing the question weighing on everyone present. "I don't know." Strange admitted, his voice heavy with the burden of having asked someone to risk complete annihilation. The transit was successful in the sense that he departed our dimension. Whether he survived to reach any destination, he trailed off, unable to offer reassurance that might be false comfort. Xavier spoke through telepresence, his voice carrying compassion that centuries of telepathic experience had taught him. He made the choice freely, understanding the risks and accepting them, because the alternative endangered those he'd sworn to protect. That is courage of the highest order, sacrifice that defines heroism in its purest form. Thor nodded gravely. Mjolnir held across his chest in salute. "The Skalds will sing of this day. Future generations in Asgard will know that a teacher from beyond our knowing gave his existence to save billions he'd never met. That is saga worthy of the greatest heroes." Tony's armor enclosed him again, faceplate hiding features that showed more emotion than the billionaire usually allowed others to see. Jarvis flagged all the data we compiled about him. Highest security classification, but accessible to anyone who might use it to help him someday. If there's a chance, any chance, we owe it to him to pursue it. The defenders began dispersing, each carrying the weight of having witnessed sacrifice that transcended normal heroism. They'd asked someone to possibly die for their world, and he'd agreed without hesitation once he understood the stakes. That kind of selfless courage was rare in any dimension, and they'd just watched it walk into oblivion. At the Pennsylvania facility, the 17 students slowly made their way back to the structure their teacher had built for them. Strange had already made arrangements. Xavier's school would accept any who wanted traditional education. Other facilities offered specialized training. The Superhuman community promised protection from government persecution. But that was future consideration. Today they grieved. Reed Richards packed his equipment methodically, his scientific mind already processing the data that would be studied for decades. The dimensional mechanics of cursed energy, the hybrid framework of magic and alien physics, the theoretical foundation for potentially contacting realities outside Earth. 616's local cluster. Knowledge purchased with sacrifice that he would ensure wasn't wasted. Strange remained at the ritual site longest, his mystical awareness monitoring the dimensional boundaries for any sign, any echo, any indication that Gojō had survived. Hours passed. The sun tracked across the sky. The Sorcerer Supreme stood vigil, honoring the sacrifice by refusing to simply walk away. As twilight approached, he thought he felt something. A distant resonance, a mathematical pattern that resembled the six eyes' enhanced perception, a hint that somewhere in the infinite multiverse, a white-haired teacher continued to exist. It might have been wishful thinking projection of desired outcome rather than genuine mystical detection. But Strange chose to interpret it as hope. He opened a portal back to the Sanctum Sanctorum and stepped through, leaving the clearing where Earth 616 had been saved by someone it would remember as legend rather than historical fact. The strongest hadn't saved the world through combat or overwhelming force. He'd saved it through wisdom to recognize when departure served better than persistence, through courage to walk into potential annihilation for people he barely knew. In his private study, Strange recorded the events in journal that future Sorcerer Supreme would inherit. The dimensional accident that brought Gojō to Earth 616. The growing threat as cursed energy destabilized reality. The desperate solution that required sacrifice from someone who'd done nothing wrong. The 17 students who'd learned that true strength included knowing when to let go. He concluded the entry with observation that carried both sadness and respect. Today we witnessed heroism of the highest order. Not the heroism of battle won or enemy defeated, but the heroism of sacrifice freely given for strangers' survival. Gojo Satoru, teacher from another universe, has earned place among Earth's greatest defenders despite spending only weeks among us. If he survived the transit, I pray he found his way home. If he didn't, I pray that the void between dimensions offered him peace. Either way, his students will carry forward his lessons, and his sacrifice will not be forgotten. Across Earth 616, the immediate danger passed. Clocks resumed normal operation as temporal drift corrected. The weave of magic healed its stress fractures over subsequent weeks. Telepathic networks stabilized. The nexus points settled back into equilibrium. To most of Earth's population, nothing had changed. They'd never known how close they'd come to dimensional collapse. Never realized that a teacher from another universe had saved them all by choosing to leave. But in certain circles, the story spread. ONE files marked the white-haired anomaly as neutralized through dimensional exile, his impossible techniques archived as Omega-level threat that fortunately departed before full assessment could be completed. The Avengers included him in their database of individuals whose power exceeded conventional threat categorization. Xavier's school added a memorial plaque honoring a fellow teacher who had given everything to protect students, not his own. The 17 mutant teenagers scattered across North America, each carrying forward lessons learned in too short time. Some joined Xavier's school, where they approached training with confidence their peers lacked. Others found different paths, But all of them remembered the white-haired teacher who'd shown them that power was tool rather than curse, that strength included knowing when to walk away. In the dark dimension, Dormammu raged at opportunity lost, but memory retained. The unlimited void technique that had demonstrated consciousness could be overwhelmed through conceptual infinity. Someday the entity would find way to replicate or counter that technique. The white-haired sorcerer had escaped, but the knowledge of what he demonstrated would serve the dark dimension's purposes eventually. 3 months after the transit ritual, Strange stood in the Sanctum Sanctorum's observation chamber and opened a scrying portal toward the space where the dimensional rift had existed. His mystical senses detected no trace of cursed energy, no echo of Gojo's presence. But sometimes, when dimensional boundaries were thin and his perception sharp, he thought he felt that distant resonance again. A mathematical pattern that suggested enhanced perception operating somewhere in the infinite multiverse. A hint that somewhere a teacher in a blindfold might be smiling as he prepared lessons for students who needed guidance. Strange closed the scrying portal and allowed himself to believe that hint represented truth rather than hope. Whether Gojo Satoru had survived or not, his impact on Earth-6 Funxine would endure. 17 students who'd learned that different didn't mean dangerous. A scientific community with expanded understanding of dimensional physics. A superhuman collective reminded that heroism sometimes meant sacrifice without glory protection, through departure rather than defense. The strongest hadn't saved the world through combat. He'd saved it through wisdom, through courage, through recognition that sometimes the greatest act of strength was choosing to let go. And somewhere in the vast multiverse, perhaps on a familiar campus in Tokyo, perhaps in Dimension Earth, 6 Reconnaissance would never reach a teacher. Might be continuing his work with new students who needed exactly what he had to offer. The story had ended. The legend would continue forever.